I've never believed in redemption. Not the kind they preach about in marble halls where soft men hide behind inherited titles and call it virtue. Redemption suggests you can wash blood from your hands with enough remorse, that darkness gives a damn about your regrets. It doesn't. I learned that truth the night my father made me watch him execute the servants who failed to polish his boots to perfection. I was 7 years old, and he wanted me to understand that mercy was just another word for weakness. So let me tell you a story about power, possession, and the kind of love that doesn't heal anything. It just gives your brutality something worth protecting. Stay with me through the darkness ahead. There's beauty in the ruins if you know where to look, and by the end, you'll understand why some monsters are made, not born. Now watch closely, because this is where the Duke learns that even iron can bend. The northern wind carried ash across Ravenspire's battlements. The morning Cedric Mordain discovered his father had sold him like livestock at auction. Not sold, precisely. Bartered, traded, leveraged in a political transaction that measured his worth in military alliances and shipping routes rather than anything resembling humanity. The old Duke had signed the betrothal contract 3 weeks prior without bothering to mention it, and Cedric only learned about his impending marriage because a junior magistrate got drunk and congratulated him at the wrong tavern. He stood now in his father's war room, the kind of cold rage that preceded violence settling into his spine like frost forming on glass. Your Grace, the engagement to Lady Seraphina Vale represents a considerable strategic advantage, the Chancellor was explaining, his voice carrying that particular nasal quality that made Cedric want to break things. Her family controls the eastern trade corridors. The marriage will secure our position against the Viral faction, and I don't recall asking for a strategic analysis, Cedric said quietly. The Chancellor's face went pale. He recognized that tone. Everyone in Ravenspire recognized that tone. It was the sound Cedric made right before someone stopped being a problem. The old Duke didn't even look up from his maps. You'll marry the Vale girl in 6 weeks. The arrangements are finalized. Her father is desperate enough to overlook your reputation in exchange for our military protection. It's an excellent transaction. Transaction, Cedric repeated, tasting the word like poison. Yes. His father finally met his eyes, and Cedric saw nothing in that gaze except calculation. The same look he'd give to a warhorse or a siege engine. Something useful that required breaking before it became valuable. You've resisted every political alliance I've proposed for 3 years. This one is not optional. The Vale girl arrives next month. And if I refuse, then I'll have you declared mentally incompetent and strip your inheritance. The old Duke smiled without warmth. You're brilliant, Cedric, but you're also volatile. The courts would believe me. They'd probably thank me for it. The other men in the room studied their boots. No one wanted to witness what happened when the Mordain family turned on itself. The last time father and son had a genuine disagreement, 2 council members ended up reassigned to mining villages on the border. Cedric walked to the window overlooking Ravenspire's courtyard. Below, soldiers drilled in formation, their movements precise and lethal. He'd trained most of them himself, knew their strengths, their weaknesses, exactly how much pressure it took to snap their loyalty. What's she like? He asked. Not because he cared, but because understanding your weapons prevented them from misfiring. Intelligent, the Chancellor offered carefully. Well-educated, her family lost most of their fortune in the coastal wars, but she was raised with all the appropriate refinements. The reports suggest she's broken enough to be obedient? Cedric turned from the window. Is that what you were going to say? I was going to say adaptable. Same thing. Cedric looked at his father. Does she know what kind of man she's being sold to? The old Duke's expression didn't change. She knows you're powerful. What else matters? What else matters, Cedric thought, and felt something dark and familiar coil through his chest. The same feeling he got before battles, when violence became inevitable and all that remained was choosing how much damage to inflict. He left the war room without being dismissed, which was its own small rebellion. His father would punish him for it later, some social humiliation or withdrawn privilege that reminded Cedric exactly where power resided in Ravenspire. The old Duke specialized in those lessons. Cedric had the scars to prove it. The castle corridors stretched before him like stone arteries, cold and echoing. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, their faces carefully neutral. Fear had a smell in Ravenspire, something metallic and sharp that clung to the tapestries and the marble floors. He found himself at the portrait gallery without consciously choosing the destination. Generations of Mordain ancestors stared down from gilded frames, their painted eyes following his movement. Conquerors and tyrants, every one of them. Not a single face suggested anything resembling kindness. His own portrait hung at the end of the gallery, commissioned when he'd turned 25 and successfully crushed the Harrow Rebellion without losing a single soldier. The artist had captured something essential in the expression. Not cruelty exactly, but the absolute absence of mercy. Cedric looked at it now and wondered if the painter had seen too much truth. "My Lord Duke." He turned to find Elena, one of the senior housekeepers, standing at a respectful distance. She was old enough to have known him since childhood, which meant she was one of approximately 3 people in Ravenspire who didn't physically shake in his presence. "What is it?" he said. "The Eastern Wing is being prepared for Lady Seraphina's arrival. Your father ordered the renovation completed by month's end." Elena's expression remained carefully neutral. "We wanted to know if you had any specific requirements for the accommodations." Cedric almost laughed. Requirements. As if this was about comfort rather than control. His father was already establishing the terrain, making sure the Veil Girl understood that she existed in Ravenspire on Mordain terms. "Make it luxurious," he said finally. "Expensive. The kind of cage aristocrats mistake for generosity." Elena didn't flinch. "Very good, my lord." She turned to leave, then paused. "If I may, my lord." "You may not," Cedric said, but without heat. "Whatever wisdom you're about to offer about marriage or patience or giving her a chance, save it. This is a political transaction, nothing more. I was actually going to ask if you wanted the hunting portraits removed from her quarters." Elena met his eyes steadily. "Most women find them unsettling." "Leave them," Cedric said. "Let her see exactly what kind of house she's entering." The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of increasingly hostile council meetings and elaborate preparations that Cedric ignored whenever possible. His father orchestrated everything with the precision of a military campaign: guest lists, ceremony protocols, strategic seating arrangements that would maximize political advantage and minimize the risk of open conflict during the wedding celebrations. Cedric trained harder than usual during those weeks, spending hours in the sparring yard until his knuckles split and blood stained the practice swords. Violence was honest in a way that politics never could be. You couldn't negotiate with a blade. Either your defense held or it didn't. Either you were strong enough to survive or you weren't. The other soldiers learned quickly to avoid him during those sessions. He fought with a kind of controlled savagery that bordered on reckless, pushing every engagement until someone yielded or collapsed from exhaustion. His opponents assumed it was about dominance, proving superiority through physical conquest. They were wrong. It was about control, specifically, proving to himself that he could still control something when every other aspect of his life was being dictated by a father who saw him as a chess piece rather than a son. Lord Voss found him in the yard 3 days before Seraphina's scheduled arrival. The older man watched in silence as Cedric disarmed 2 opponents simultaneously, then drove a third to his knees with a strike that would have shattered bone if he hadn't pulled it at the last second. "You're going to kill someone if you keep this up," Voss observed. Cedric wiped sweat from his face. "Is that a problem?" "It is if you do it before the wedding. Your father is already concerned about your cooperation. My father can—" Cedric caught himself, the old habit of self-preservation kicking in before he said something truly unforgivable. "He's concerned I'll embarrass him in front of the Vale family. That's different from actual concern." Voss had been a military commander for 30 years and understood the distinction. "The girl arrives in 2 days. Have you thought about what you're going to say when you meet her?" "No." "Perhaps you should." Cedric looked at him. "Why?" "So I can pretend this is something other than a hostage exchange? She's being purchased with military protection. I'm being purchased with trade agreements and political leverage. The only difference between us is that I already understand I'm property." Voss studied him with something that might have been pity on a less disciplined face. "You're not your father," he said quietly. "No," Cedric agreed. "I'm worse. He at least pretends there's nobility in what we do. I stopped pretending years ago." He left the yard before Voss could respond, ignoring the looks from the soldiers who'd witnessed the exchange. Let them gossip. Let them wonder if the young duke was as monstrous as his reputation suggested. Fear was useful. Fear kept people at a distance where they couldn't become liabilities. That night, Kydrick stood in the quarters being prepared for Serafina and tried to imagine what kind of woman would agree to this arrangement. Desperate, probably. Maybe ambitious. Definitely calculating, because anyone raised in aristocratic circles understood that marriage was warfare by other means. The rooms were beautiful in the way that money could manufacture beauty. Silk curtains from the southern kingdoms, furniture carved from rare wood, carpets that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. His father had insisted on making it obvious that Ravenspire possessed wealth to match its military power. But beneath the luxury, the message was clear. These quarters had only one entrance, easily monitored. The windows overlooked interior courtyards rather than escape routes. The decoration was exquisite, but the architecture was prison. Kydrick ran his hand along the bedpost, feeling the smooth wood under his palm. In 6 weeks, there would be a wedding. Vows would be spoken. Legal documents signed. And he would own another human being the same way he owned his warhorse and his ancestral sword. The thought should have meant nothing to him. He'd been raised to view people as resources, strategic assets to be deployed or discarded based on utility. Emotion was the luxury of weak men who couldn't afford to make hard decisions. But standing there in that beautiful cage his father had constructed, Kydrick felt something unexpected and deeply unwelcome stir in his chest. Not guilt. He'd murdered that particular weakness years ago. Curiosity. He wanted to know what kind of woman could look at this arrangement, this blatant transaction masquerading as tradition, and still walk into Ravenspire with her dignity intact. Wanted to know if she was genuinely foolish enough to believe this could become something other than mutual imprisonment. Wanted to know if she understood that the real monster in Ravenspire wasn't the old duke who'd orchestrated this marriage. It was the son who was going to let it happen. Bammed. Serafina Vale arrived on a morning when frost turned Ravenspire's courtyards into something almost beautiful, the kind of cold that bit through wool and made breath visible in the air. Kydrick watched from the battlements as her carriage passed through the main gates, flanked by guards bearing the remnants of House Vale's tattered banners. The procession looked more like a funeral than a wedding party, which was probably accurate. She was being buried alive in political necessity, just with better scenery. "Your presence is required in the greeting hall," a servant informed him nervously. Kydrick didn't move. Let her wait. If this is about power dynamics, we start as we mean to continue. The old duke specifically requested. The servant wisely stopped talking when Kydrick turned to look at him. Messages didn't require completion when the meaning was already clear. He descended from the battlement slowly, giving Serafina time to fully appreciate the castle's oppressive grandeur. The greeting hall had been designed to intimidate visiting nobles. Vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, marble columns imported from conquered territories, and enough armed guards to make peaceful negotiation the only logical option. His father stood at the center of it all, playing the gracious host with practiced ease. Next to him, looking small and vulnerable despite her formal court dress, was Serafina. Kydrick's first thought was that the reports had failed to mention her eyes. They were the color of winter storms, gray and sharp, and absolutely fearless. She watched him approach with the kind of assessment usually reserved for examining weapons before battle, cataloging details and calculating threat levels. His second thought was that she was going to be a problem. "Lady Serafina," his father said warmly, performing hospitality like a well-rehearsed script. "May I present my son, Kydrick Mordain, Duke of Ravenspire and your intended husband." Serafina offered the minimum courtesy required by protocol. A slight nod, not quite a bow. "My Lord Duke," she said, and her voice carried an edge that suggested she was measuring her words very carefully. Kydrick studied her openly, not bothering with the pretense of subtlety. She was beautiful in a way that suggested discipline rather than accident. Posture too perfect, expression too controlled, everything about her calibrated for maximum strategic impact. "You're younger than I expected," he said. Something flickered behind those storm-colored eyes. "I could say the same, but I suspect we both know age has nothing to do with the kind of damage people can inflict." The old duke stiffened slightly. "Serafina, darling, perhaps we should—" "I wasn't insulting your son," she interrupted, still looking directly at Kydrick. "I was acknowledging reality. That's still permitted in Ravenspire, isn't it? Or do the rules here require prettier lies?" Kydrick felt his father's anger like static electricity before a storm. No one spoke to the duke that way. No one interrupted him. And certainly no one questioned Ravenspire's rules within an hour of arrival. But Kydrick found himself smiling, which was unusual enough that several guards exchanged concerned glances. "Reality is always permitted," he said quietly, though most people are too afraid to acknowledge it. "Welcome to Ravenspire, Lady Seraphina. I think you're going to hate it here." She met his smile with one of her own, sharp and completely devoid of warmth. "I already do, my lord. But I imagine that was the point." The formal dinner that evening was a masterclass in aristocratic warfare disguised as hospitality. 40 guests filled Ravenspire's main hall. Nobility from across the northern territories gathered to witness the Mordain Vale alliance and calculate how it would affect their own political positions. Conversation flowed like poisoned wine, sweet on the surface, lethal if you weren't paying attention. Kedrick sat at the head table between his father and Seraphina, watching her navigate the social battlefield with surprising skill. She'd changed into a gown the color of smoke, something that suggested mourning without quite committing to it, and her conversation was calculated to be charming without revealing anything substantive. Lord Harwick, a bloated fool who'd inherited more wealth than sense, was currently monopolizing her attention with a long story about his hunting estates. Kedrick had been forced to endure the man's company at dozens of similar functions and knew exactly how this would end, with Harwick assuming his wealth and title made him interesting, and whoever he was talking to searching desperately for an exit. But Seraphina was listening with apparent fascination, asking questions that kept Harwick talking while she barely touched her wine. Kedrick recognized the technique. Give people enough rope and they'd hang themselves without realizing you were holding the noose. "And how many stags did you bring down this season?" she asked at exactly the right moment. 47, Harwick announced proudly. "A new personal record." 47, Seraphina repeated, her tone perfectly neutral. "That's quite remarkable. Tell me, Lord Harwick, do you find that killing something makes you feel powerful, or does it just remind you that power is the only thing you have?" The table went silent. Harwick's face cycled through confusion, then anger, then uncertainty as he tried to determine if he'd been insulted. "I'm not sure I understand, my lady." Seraphina set down her wine glass with deliberate care. "I'm asking whether you hunt because you enjoy it, or because you need constant proof that you're capable of dominance over something weaker than yourself. It's an honest question. I find that powerful men often conflate the two." Kedrick felt something dangerous and unexpected unfold in his chest. Not quite amusement, though that was part of it. Admiration, maybe, at watching her eviscerate Harwick with perfect politeness, while the old fool couldn't even identify the weapon being used. His father, however, was less entertained. "Seraphina, perhaps we should discuss less controversial topics," the old duke suggested with forced warmth. "Lord Harwick has been a loyal friend to House Mordain for many years." "Has he?" Seraphina turned those storm-colored eyes on Kedrick's father. "How fortunate for you both. Though I confess I'm still learning what loyalty means in Ravenspire. At home, we defined it as choosing to stand with someone rather than being purchased or coerced. Is the definition different here?" The old duke's smile turned glacial. "We define loyalty as understanding one's obligations and fulfilling them without complaint. Perhaps your family's financial difficulties prevented them from teaching you that particular lesson." It was a direct hit, meant to remind Seraphina that she existed here on Mordain charity, that her ruined house had no leverage and even less pride. Kedrick watched her absorb the blow, waiting to see if she'd retreat or escalate. She chose escalation. "My family's financial difficulties," Seraphina said slowly, "were the result of supporting a war against the Virel faction's territorial ambitions. We lost everything defending the eastern trade routes that House Mordain now benefits from. So yes, Your Grace, I'm quite familiar with obligations. I'm just accustomed to honoring them through sacrifice rather than transaction." She paused, letting that sink in before delivering the killing strike. "But I understand that here in Ravenspire, you prefer to measure loyalty in gold rather than blood. It's certainly more efficient, even if it's less honest." The entire hall held its breath, waiting to see how the old duke would respond to being called a liar in his own castle. Several of the older nobles looked like they were witnessing a suicide in slow motion. Kedrick should have intervened, should have smoothed things over, reminded Seraphina that political survival required knowing when to yield. His father's anger was a physical force in the room, and everyone present understood that insulting the duke came with consequences. Instead, he picked up his wine glass and took a long drink, watching the scene unfold with something approaching genuine interest. His father's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft and extremely dangerous. "You have strong opinions for someone who arrived this morning." "I have honest opinions," Serafina corrected. "Is that discouraged here?" The old duke stood, which was the social equivalent of drawing a weapon. The dinner ended when he decided it ended, and he'd clearly decided. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said with forced courtesy, "I believe Lady Serafina requires rest after her journey. Please excuse us while we attend to our guests' comfort." Translation. The public humiliation was over. Now came the private consequences. Serafina rose with grace that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and refused to show fear. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said to the assembled nobles. "I look forward to getting to know you all better." She followed the old duke from the hall, her posture perfect, her face betraying nothing. Cedric remained seated, finishing his wine while the other guests erupted into frantic, whispered speculation. They'd witnessed something extraordinary. A woman with no power, no protection, and no apparent survival instinct had just challenged the Duke of Ravenspire in front of his entire court. Most assumed she was suicidal. Cedric knew better. She was testing the boundaries, measuring exactly how much resistance Ravenspire would tolerate before it destroyed her. It was the same thing he'd done at her age. The same desperate calculation everyone made when they realized they were trapped. The difference was that most people learned quickly to stop resisting. Cedric suspected Serafina was not most people. He found her 2 hours later in the Eastern Wing's library, which suggested either remarkable boldness or spectacular ignorance about Ravenspire's rules. Guests didn't wander the castle unsupervised, certainly not after humiliating the Duke in public. She was standing by the window overlooking the northern cliffs, still wearing the smoke-colored gown, her reflection ghost-like against the dark glass. "You're not supposed to be here," Cedric said from the doorway. She didn't turn around. "Neither are you. Your father made it quite clear I should remain in my quarters until he decided whether I was worth the trouble of keeping. And yet here you are. Either you're stupid or you don't care about consequences." Now she looked at him, and her expression suggested she was done pretending to be harmless. "I care about consequences, my lord. I just refuse to pretend that obedience will protect me when we both know it won't. Your father was going to punish me regardless of how I behaved at dinner. At least this way I maintain my dignity." Cedric closed the library door behind him, which was either a threat or a promise, depending on how she chose to interpret it. "He wants me to discipline you. Said you needed to understand how things work in Ravenspire before the wedding. And will you?" she asked, her voice perfectly steady. "Discipline me?" He moved closer, studying her face for signs of fear. Found none, which was either impressive or insane. "That depends on what you think discipline means. In my experience, it means powerful men hurting people weaker than themselves and calling it education. Your experience sounds limited." Serafina laughed, and the sound held no humor whatsoever. "My father sold me to settle his debts. My mother died when I was 12 and spent her last years being slowly crushed by a man who confused control with love. I've watched every woman in my family learn that survival means accepting whatever cage they're offered and being grateful it's lined with silk instead of iron. So yes, my lord, my experience with powerful men is extremely limited. I've only seen them destroy everything they touch." Cedric stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she'd have to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. Most people stepped back when he invaded their space like this. Serafina held her ground. "You think I'm like your father," he said quietly. "I think you're worse," she corrected. "He at least believed he loved us. You don't even bother with that particular lie." It should have made him angry, should have triggered the same cold rage that always surfaced when people presumed to judge him. Instead, Cedric felt something shift in his chest, recognition sliding into place like a key in a lock. She wasn't afraid because she'd already accepted the worst possible outcome. Fear only worked when you had something left to lose. "You're right," he said. "I don't love you. I don't even know you. This marriage is a political transaction that benefits both our houses, and pretending otherwise would insult us both." "Then why are you here?" she asked. "If you don't care, why aren't you letting your father handle this however he wants?" "Because," Cedric said, and paused, surprised to find himself actually considering honesty, "I don't want you broken. Obedient, maybe. Compliant when it matters, but not broken. Ravenspire already has enough empty women wandering these halls pretending to be alive." "How generous," Serafina said dryly. You want me imprisoned but functional. Truly, my lord, your compassion knows no bounds. I'm not offering compassion. I'm offering a negotiation. She studied him for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes seeing too much. What are the terms? You stop humiliating my father in public. You play the role expected of a duchess, gracious, elegant, supportive. In exchange, I'll ensure he doesn't punish you for tonight, and I'll give you autonomy within reasonable boundaries. Reasonable boundaries, she repeated. Defined by whom? By me. So I trade one cage for another, she said. At least your father's cage came with the pretense of family. Yours just comes with better terms of imprisonment. Yes, Kedrick agreed. But you'll notice I'm not lying about what this is. Serafina turned back to the window, and for the first time since arriving at Ravenspire, her perfect composure cracked slightly. I had a tutor once who told me that power without accountability becomes tyranny, and tyranny without resistance becomes normal. She said the most dangerous thing a person can do is accept injustice as inevitable. Your tutor sounds naive. She was brilliant, Serafina corrected, and they executed her for speaking truth to the emperor about peasant starvation in the southern provinces. So yes, I suppose brilliance and naivete look similar when the powerful decide what truth they'll tolerate. Kedrick felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut. Not quite shame, because he'd learned to kill that emotion young, but recognition, maybe. Understanding that the woman standing in front of him had watched power destroy someone she respected and learned all the wrong lessons, or possibly all the right ones. I can't change what happened to your tutor, he said finally. Can't change that you're here because your father was desperate and mine was strategic. Can't change that this marriage is happening whether you want it or not. But I can make it survivable if you're smart enough to work with me instead of against me. She looked at him then, really looked, and Kedrick wondered what she saw. Monster, probably. Tyrant. The kind of man her tutor had warned her about. He wasn't wrong. Define survivable, she said. You get to keep your mind, your opinions, the parts of yourself that make you dangerous. I don't need a decorative wife who smiles on command. I need someone who understands how power works and knows when to use it. And in exchange, she asked slowly, you get what exactly? Kedrick considered lying, offering some politically acceptable answer about partnership and mutual benefit. But she'd already called him out for dishonesty once tonight, and he'd told her he wouldn't insult them both with pretense. Compliance, he said bluntly. When I need you to support me publicly, when I need someone who can navigate court politics without making us look weak, when you need to prove to everyone that you're powerful enough to tame the sharp-tongued Veil girl, she finished, that you can own someone intelligent without breaking them, which is apparently the only thing that impresses people in this God's-forsaken place. Kedrick didn't deny it. Yes, Serafina was quiet for long enough that he thought she might refuse, thought she might choose pride over survival and force him to find less pleasant ways to ensure her cooperation. Then she extended her hand, and her expression suggested she was making a deal with the devil, but at least doing it with open eyes. One condition, she said. If I agree to play your perfect duchess in public, you agree to be honest with me in private. No pretty lies about affection or fate or any of the other poison aristocrats use to make imprisonment feel like destiny. If this is a transaction, we treat it like one. Kedrick took her hand, her skin cold against his palm. Agreed. They shook on it like business partners rather than future spouses, and somehow that felt more honest than any wedding vow could ever be. As Serafina withdrew her hand and turned back to the window, Kedrick allowed himself one moment of truth. He'd negotiated this arrangement intending to acquire a useful political asset, someone decorative enough to satisfy his father's expectations and strategic enough to be valuable. But watching her stand there in the library's shadows, defiant and damaged and absolutely refusing to break, Kedrick realized he might have miscalculated, because ownership implied control, and he was starting to suspect that Serafina Veil was going to be significantly harder to control than anticipated. Say, the wedding preparations consumed Ravenspire like a beautiful plague. Servants transformed the cathedral into something approaching spectacle. Flowers imported from the southern kingdoms. Silk banners bearing both Mordain and Veil crests. Enough gold decoration to fund a small war. His father orchestrated everything with obsessive precision, ensuring that every detail communicated wealth and power to the hundreds of nobles who would attend. Kedrick avoided most of it, which was easy since no one actually wanted his input. He was the groom, which meant he needed to appear at the ceremony looking appropriately ducal and not embarrass anyone. Everything else could be managed by people who cared about aesthetic perfection. He spent those weeks training, hunting, and trying not to think about the fact that in less than a month he'd be legally bound to a woman who looked at him like he was a problem requiring a solution. Serafina, to her credit, played her role flawlessly. She attended every social gathering with perfect grace, charmed visiting nobles with intelligent conversation, and managed to seem grateful for the marriage without actually lying about enthusiasm. His father was pleased, which meant the public humiliation at dinner had been forgotten in favor of appreciating her strategic value. But Ceadric noticed things his father missed. The way Serafina's smile never quite reached her eyes. The careful distance she maintained from everyone in Ravenspire, like she was cataloging potential allies and threats, but refusing to trust anyone. The nights he'd find her in the library, reading treatises on military strategy and political philosophy, instead of the romantic poetry decorative wives were supposed to prefer. She was preparing for something, learning the terrain, gathering intelligence. He just wasn't sure if she was preparing to survive Ravenspire or destroy it. 3 weeks before the wedding, Lord Voss requested a private meeting in Ceadric's study. The old soldier looked troubled, which was unusual enough to be concerning. "We have a problem," Voss said without preamble. "The kind that requires your attention rather than your father's." Ceadric poured them both whiskey, recognizing the tone that preceded complicated situations. "What kind of problem?" "The virile faction is moving against us. Intelligence reports suggest Duke Octavian is building alliances with the Eastern houses, leveraging your upcoming marriage as evidence that Ravenspire is spreading too far too fast. He's arguing that if we control both the northern territories and the eastern trade routes, we'll effectively dominate the entire region." "We will," Ceadric said bluntly. "That's the entire point of the marriage." "Yes, but Octavian is positioning it as a threat to regional stability. He's suggesting that other houses should form a defensive alliance before Ravenspire becomes too powerful to oppose." Ceadric swirled the whiskey, considering implications. "Octavian's smart. If he can unite enough houses against us before the wedding, he could actually challenge our position." "What's his timeline?" "That's the concerning part." Voss leaned forward. "He's planning to move during the wedding itself. Maximum visibility, maximum political impact. If he can humiliate Ravenspire in front of the entire northern court, he destroys your father's reputation and fractures any alliances we've built. Humiliate us how? We're not sure yet. The intelligence is fragmentary, but whatever he's planning, it's designed to make Ravenspire look weak. Possibly an assassination attempt, possibly exposing some scandal, possibly even kidnapping Serafina before the ceremony." Ceadric felt the familiar cold calculation settle into place. The mental shift that happened when violence became not just possible, but necessary. "Does my father know?" "Not yet. I wanted to bring this to you first because—" Voss hesitated, choosing words carefully. "Because your father will respond with overwhelming force. He'll cancel the wedding, execute anyone with suspected viral connections, and turn this into open war, which would make us look exactly as dangerous as Octavian is claiming we are." "Precisely." Ceadric stood, moving to the window that overlooked Ravenspire's training yards. Below, soldiers drilled in the cold morning air, their movements synchronized and lethal. His soldiers, men he'd trained to follow orders without question and kill without hesitation. "What would you do?" he asked Voss, "if the decision was yours?" "I'd let Octavian make his move," the old soldier said quietly. "Let him expose himself during the wedding. Then respond with surgical precision instead of wholesale slaughter. Show the other houses that Ravenspire is powerful enough to survive attack and disciplined enough not to overreact." "It's a risk," Ceadric said. "If his plan succeeds, we look weak regardless of how we respond afterward. If his plan succeeds, you were never strong enough to deserve Ravenspire in the first place." Ceadric smiled without humor. "Flattery won't work on me, Voss. I'm not flattering you, I'm stating fact. You're a better strategist than your father ever was. And you're ruthless enough to make hard decisions without letting pride override judgment. Octavian is counting on your father's predictability. Don't give him what he expects." It made sense. Tactical, brutal sense that appealed to every instinct Ceadric possessed. Let the enemy think they had an advantage. Let them commit resources to an attack. Then crush them so thoroughly that everyone watching understood exactly what happened to people who challenged Ravenspire. But there was a complication his father's political calculus wouldn't account for. Serafina. If Octavian's plan involved targeting her, kidnapping, assassination, public humiliation, then letting it proceed meant using her as bait, meant putting her directly in danger to achieve strategic advantage. Kadric should have been fine with that. She was a political asset, useful primarily for the alliances she represented. Protecting those alliances was more important than protecting any individual. But he remembered standing with her in the library, remembered the negotiation they'd made, remembered promising her that while he couldn't change the reality of their arrangement, he could make it survivable. Using her as bait without warning her violated that agreement. Not because of morality or honor or any other noble sentiment, but because Kadric had learned long ago that the moment you started breaking agreements was the moment people stopped trusting you, and trust was significantly more valuable than temporary tactical advantage. "Tell me about the intelligence we have on Octavian's specific plans," he said to Voss. The older man pulled out detailed maps and began explaining what they knew, what they suspected, and where the gaps in their information remained. Kadric listened carefully, his mind already calculating how to turn an assassination attempt into a public relations victory without getting Serafina killed in the process. It was going to require telling her the truth, which was going to be uncomfortable, because the truth was that Kadric had just decided her survival was more strategically valuable than whatever brief satisfaction would come from watching Octavian's plan collapse. He wasn't sure if that counted as protecting her or just smart asset management, probably both. What? He found Serafina in the cathedral late that evening, examining the wedding preparations with an expression that suggested she was mentally calculating escape routes rather than admiring floral arrangements. "We need to talk," Kadric said from the entrance. She turned, and something in his tone must have communicated urgency, because her entire posture shifted, that perfect aristocratic mask sliding into place. "What happened?" "There's going to be an attempt on your life during the wedding. Probably mine as well, but you're the primary target." To her credit, she didn't panic, didn't gasp or demand protection, or do any of the useless things decorative wives were supposed to do when faced with danger. "Who?" she asked simply. "Duke Octavian Viral. He's building a coalition against Ravenspire, and making you a widow before you're technically a wife sends the right message about our vulnerability." Serafina processed this information with the same clinical assessment she'd shown examining the cathedral's architecture. "Does your father know?" "Not yet. And I'm not going to tell him because his response would be to cancel the wedding and execute everyone with viral connections, which gives Octavian exactly the overreaction he wants. So instead, she said slowly, "You're going to let the assassination attempt proceed and use it to demonstrate Ravenspire's strength. Turn a potential weakness into a show of power." "Yes. And you're telling me this why?" "Surely it would be more strategically sound to let me remain ignorant. Easier to control my reactions if I don't know I'm bait." Kadric moved closer, studying her face in the cathedral's dim light. "Because we made an agreement. Honesty in private, even when it's inconvenient." Serafina's expression suggested she was reassessing him entirely. "You're risking operational security to honor an agreement no one witnessed and no contract enforces. That's either remarkably honorable or catastrophically stupid." "Probably both," he admitted. "But here's the reality. I need you functional, not traumatized. If Octavian's people attack and you're unprepared, you'll be a liability. If you know what's coming, you can be an asset. You mean I can help you kill them?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, her fingers running along the edge of a wooden pew. When she spoke again, her voice carried something Kadric hadn't heard from her before. Not fear exactly. Anticipation. "What do you need me to do?" They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for war disguised as a wedding. Kadric positioned additional guards throughout the cathedral, all of them people he trusted personally rather than his father's traditional choices. He revised the ceremony's schedule to create choke points where attackers would have limited options. He ensured that every entrance had multiple defensive positions and every exit could be locked down in seconds. And he trained Serafina, not in combat, because she'd never become proficient enough in 2 weeks to be useful in actual fighting, but in survival. Where to position herself during the ceremony to minimize exposure, how to identify threats before they materialized, what signals his guards would use if they detected danger. She learned fast, which didn't surprise him. Intelligence was its own kind of weapon. and Serafina had clearly spent her entire life learning to see things others missed. What surprised him was that she seemed to enjoy it, not the danger exactly, but the preparation, the strategic thinking, the recognition that she could be something other than decorative if someone bothered to teach her how. One night, practicing emergency evacuation routes through Ravenspire's hidden passages, she asked the question Kaedric had been expecting. "Why train me at all? If the attack comes, your guards will handle it. I'm just a liability you need to keep alive." "You're not a liability," he said, checking that a particular corridor remained unmonitored. "You're an asset that happens to require protection." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Liabilities are dead weight. Assets contribute value. You've proven you can think strategically and control your fear response. That's useful." Serafina stopped walking, forcing him to turn back. Her expression in the torchlight was complicated, something between gratitude and suspicion. "You keep saying things that almost sound like compliments and then undermining them with pragmatism. It's confusing." "Good," Kaedric said. "Confusion keeps you alert." She laughed, the sound echoing off stone walls. "You know, my lord, most men who intended to marry me would at least pretend to care whether I lived or died. Most men are liars. And you're not?" "I'm a liar when it serves my purposes. But lying to you seems inefficient. You'd figure it out eventually, and then I'd lose whatever minimal trust we've established." Serafina studied him for a long moment. "There's something deeply wrong with you," she said finally. "You understand that, right? Normal people don't approach relationships like military campaigns. I don't have relationships. I have strategic alliances that occasionally involve physical proximity." "What a romantic," she said dryly. "Truly my heart swells with affection." Kaedric felt his mouth twitch toward something that might have been a smile if he still remembered how those worked. "Your heart can swell or shrink as it prefers. As long as you're alive and functional, I've fulfilled my obligations." Such lofty standards. "I can see why your father chose you to continue the family line. He chose me because I'm exactly like him," Kaedric said, and the truth of it tasted like ash. Ruthless, calculating, and entirely incapable of caring about anything beyond power and survival. Serafina's expression shifted, something softer creeping in that looked almost like pity. "That's not true." "Yes, it is." "No," she said quietly. "If you were exactly like your father, you wouldn't have told me about Octavian's plans. You would have used me without warning and justified it as necessary sacrifice." "But you didn't. Which means somewhere in all that carefully constructed brutality, you actually possess ethics." "Ethics are weakness," Kaedric said automatically. "The old lessons rising like muscle memory. Only if you define strength as the absence of conscience." Serafina moved closer, close enough that he could see silver flecks in those storm-colored eyes. "Your father believes that. You were raised to believe that. But I don't think you actually do. You don't know me. I know you're not nearly as monstrous as you pretend to be. I know you've spent 2 weeks teaching me how to survive when it would be easier to just increase the guards. I know you keep your agreements even when breaking them would be strategically advantageous." She paused, and her next words landed with unexpected weight. "I know you're terrified of being vulnerable, so you turn everything into a transaction where emotions don't matter. But transactions don't explain why you check that I'm eating properly at meals, or why you positioned guards outside my quarters even though your father didn't order it, or why you look relieved every time I show up somewhere alive." Kaedric felt something dangerous crack open in his chest, the kind of weakness that got people killed. "I do those things because you're valuable," he said, but even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "Keep telling yourself that," Serafina said, and there was no mockery in her voice. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, my lord." She walked past him toward the passage exit, leaving Kaedric standing alone in the torchlit corridor, trying to remember when exactly his carefully maintained armor had started developing fractures. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze breath in the air. Kaedric stood in his quarters being dressed in formal ceremony clothing while servants fussed over details that didn't matter. The jacket was black velvet with silver embroidery representing Mordane's ancestral claims. The weapons were ceremonial but sharpened, because Kaedric didn't carry useless weapons regardless of tradition. "Your father requests your presence before the ceremony," a servant informed him nervously. Of course he did. Kaedric found the old duke in his private study, already dressed and looking every inch the aristocratic patriarch. Power sat on his shoulders like a well-fitted coat, comfortable, and absolute. "I wanted to speak with you before you married the Veil girl," his father said without preamble, "to ensure we understand each other." "We understand each other perfectly," Kedrick said. "You wanted a strategic alliance. You're getting one." "I wanted more than an alliance." The old Duke's expression was cold, calculating. "I wanted proof that you could control something valuable without destroying it, that you'd inherited my strategic intelligence along with my ruthlessness." "And have I?" His father studied him for a long moment. "You've surprised me," he said finally. "The girl could have been a disaster. Instead, she's become an asset. The other houses respect her intelligence while still viewing her as appropriately subordinate to Ravenspire's interests. That's precisely the balance we needed." Kedrick felt something twist in his gut. "She's not subordinate. She's strategic." The old Duke smiled. "That's the same thing, Kedrick. Power is always about control. Either you control her, or she becomes a problem. Right now, you found a way to make her useful while maintaining dominance. Don't confuse cooperation with partnership. There was a time when those words would have landed as simple truth. Wisdom from a father who'd spent decades mastering the brutal calculus of power. Now they just sounded empty. "What if I want partnership?" Kedrick heard himself say, surprised by his own audacity. His father's expression turned to stone. "Then you're weak, and weakness gets you killed. Or maybe," Kedrick said quietly, "maybe treating every relationship as a contest destroys the only things that make power worth having." The old Duke stood, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "I gave you everything. Trained you to survive in a world that eats the sentimental and spits out their bones. Turned you into someone powerful enough to inherit Ravenspire without being destroyed by it. And now you're telling me you want to throw that away for a girl you've known less than 2 months? I'm saying that treating people like chess pieces has cost us everything that matters. I'm saying that maybe there's a difference between being powerful and being alone." His father moved closer, and Kedrick saw genuine rage beneath that controlled exterior. "You think isolation is a choice? It's a requirement. Every great ruler in history understood that love is leverage. Give someone your heart, and you've handed them a weapon aimed directly at your throat." "Maybe," Kedrick agreed, "but I'd rather have a weapon at my throat than live in a fortress so isolated that victory becomes indistinguishable from death." The old Duke stared at him like he was witnessing a stranger. "You're making a mistake." "Probably," Kedrick said, "but at least it'll be my mistake instead of your legacy." He left before his father could respond, ignoring the servants who scrambled out of his path. The ceremony would start in less than an hour, and Kedrick was absolutely certain that Duke Octavian's attack would come before he finished exchanging vows. But for the first time in his life, Kedrick wasn't entering a fight solely concerned with survival. He was protecting something that mattered, even if admitting that would probably get him killed. The cathedral filled with nobles like predators gathering at a carcass, each one calculating how this marriage would affect their own political position. Kedrick stood at the altar in his formal blacks, watching faces while his mind ran through defensive scenarios and threat assessments. Voss had positioned guards at every strategic point, disguised as ceremonial attendants. They were good enough that most of the nobility wouldn't notice the extra security. But Octavian's people would, which meant the attack would come from somewhere unexpected. The ceremony music began, that particular blend of solemn and celebratory that aristocrats preferred for joining bloodlines. Nobles turned toward the entrance where Serafina would appear. And when she did, Kedrick forgot every tactical preparation he'd made. She wore silver, not white. The gown moved like liquid metal, catching light and shadow in ways that made her look both armored and ethereal. Her hair was bound with Veil's ancestral jewelry, sapphires that matched the frost on Ravenspire's cliffs. Her face was composed, perfect, absolutely impossible to read. She walked down that cathedral aisle like she was approaching execution or coronation, and Kedrick couldn't tell which. When she reached the altar and their eyes met, he saw fear there, not of the ceremony or the marriage itself. Fear of whatever was about to happen. She'd seen something, noticed a threat his guards had missed. Kedrick shifted position slightly, a movement that would look like nervousness to most observers, but signaled his guards to increase alertness. Voss caught the gesture and began repositioning people without making it obvious. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the cathedral, while nobles shifted in their seats and pretended to care about the vows being exchanged. Kedrick barely heard the words. His entire focus was on cataloging everyone in the cathedral, searching for whatever had triggered Seraphina's fear. Then he saw it. Lord Harwick, the bloated fool Seraphina had humiliated at dinner, was holding his wine glass wrong. Not obviously wrong. Just wrong enough that someone who'd grown up in aristocratic circles would notice. Except it wasn't wine in that glass. Caedric's mind calculated angles and timing in the space between heartbeats. Harwick was positioned perfectly to throw liquid toward the altar when the ceremony reached its climax. The substance was probably acid or poison, something designed to scar or kill without requiring accuracy. And Seraphina would be the primary target. The priest reached the binding vows, the moment when Caedric was supposed to promise loyalty and protection to his new wife. Instead, he moved. 3 things happened simultaneously. Caedric pulled Seraphina behind him, his body becoming a shield. Harwick threw the glass's contents in a wide arc toward the altar, and Voss's guards opened fire with crossbows that had been concealed beneath ceremonial robes. The liquid never reached Seraphina. It hit Caedric's shoulder instead, burning through velvet and flesh like concentrated hatred. The pain was immediate and excruciating, the kind that turned vision white and made breathing impossible. But he didn't move, didn't let Seraphina go. Didn't give Octavian's people the satisfaction of seeing Ravenspire's heir fall. Harwick was dead before the glass hit the cathedral floor, 3 crossbow bolts buried in his chest. The nobles erupted into chaos, screaming and scrambling for exits while Voss's guards systematically locked down every entrance. The old duke was shouting orders, his voice cutting through panic like a blade. And Seraphina was holding Caedric upright, her hands surprisingly strong for someone who supposedly had no combat training. "Don't you dare die," she hissed in his ear. "Don't you dare make me a widow 5 minutes before making me a wife." Caedric tried to laugh, which turned into a cough that tasted like blood and burnt flesh. "Always so romantic," he managed. "You're an idiot," she said, and there were tears in her voice. "A strategic, calculating idiot who just threw away every tactical advantage to protect a chess piece." "You're not a chess piece." "No," she agreed, her hands putting pressure on his wounded shoulder even though the acid had already done its damage. "I'm not, and apparently neither are you." The cathedral descended into organized chaos as Ravenspire's guards secured every potential threat, and the old duke began the systematic process of identifying everyone connected to the assassination attempt. Nobles were separated, questioned, detained, or released based on interrogations that would probably result in several executions before morning. But Caedric wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was looking at Seraphina, at her face streaked with tears and fury, at the way she refused to let go of him even when the healers arrived with bandages and ointment. "Why?" she asked him while they worked on his shoulder. "Why step in front of me when you've spent 6 weeks convincing me you only care about strategic advantage?" Caedric considered lying, considered offering some politically acceptable answer about protecting valuable assets or maintaining alliance credibility. Instead, he told her the truth, because losing you felt like losing the only honest thing in Ravenspire. Seraphina's breath caught, and for the first time since he'd known her, the perfect aristocratic mask completely shattered. "You're supposed to be a monster," she whispered. "I am a monster," Caedric said, the words slurring slightly as whatever the healers had given him for pain started to work. But even monsters can recognize when they've found something worth protecting. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was Seraphina's face, beautiful and terrified and absolutely furious. And the thought that crossed his mind before darkness claimed him entirely was simple. He'd started this marriage wanting a strategic alliance. He'd ended the ceremony realizing he'd accidentally found something significantly more dangerous, something that felt suspiciously like it might actually matter. When Caedric woke, Ravenspire's political landscape had fundamentally changed. The healer said the scarring would be permanent. Caedric examined his shoulder in the mirror 3 days after the assassination attempt, watching morning light catch the twisted flesh where acid had eaten through muscle and bone. The wound had been cleaned, treated, wrapped in expensive bandages soaked in medicines imported from the southern kingdoms. None of it mattered. The damage was already done. The scar ran from collarbone to shoulder blade, raised and discolored, a permanent reminder that he'd chosen protection over self-preservation, that for approximately 3 seconds during his own wedding ceremony, he'd been stupid enough to value something more than strategic advantage. Your father wants to see you, Voss said from the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Of course he did. Kedrick pulled on a shirt, ignoring the way fabric caught on damaged tissue. The pain was constant now, a low burn that sharpened whenever he moved wrong. The healers had offered stronger medicines, opiates that would dull sensation and make him useless. He'd refused. Pain was information. It reminded him that weakness had consequences. He found the old Duke in the throne room, standing before the bodies of 7 men who'd been executed at dawn. They hung from iron hooks driven through their rib cages, displayed like hunting trophies for anyone entering Ravenspire to witness. Lord Harwick's corpse occupied the center position. Octavian's conspiracy is larger than we anticipated, his father said without looking at him. Harwick was just the visible piece. We've identified 17 nobles with confirmed connections to the Virel faction. All of them attended your wedding. All of them knew about the attack. How many have you arrested? 12. The rest fled before we could secure them. The old Duke finally turned, and his expression was absolutely devoid of warmth. This is what happens when you show mercy, Kedrick. When you negotiate instead of dominating. Those men saw your arrangement with the Veil Girl as weakness, proof that Ravenspire was willing to compromise. I wasn't showing mercy. I was being strategic. You were being sentimental. His father moved closer, studying the bandages visible beneath Kedrick's shirt. You took an acid bath meant for a political asset. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending that was calculated. She's my wife now. Protecting her she's a contract. His father's voice dropped to something dangerous and cold. A signed agreement that benefits both houses. Nothing more. The moment you start believing otherwise is the moment you become vulnerable, and vulnerability in our position is fatal. Kedrick felt rage building in his chest, the kind that usually preceded violence. You wanted me to marry her. You orchestrated this entire arrangement. I wanted you to control her, to demonstrate that you could manage a valuable asset without letting emotion compromise your judgment. Instead, you've proven that sentiment makes you reckless. I saved her life. You exposed yourself, the old Duke corrected. Every noble house in the north now knows that the heir to Ravenspire will sacrifice tactical advantage to protect someone he claims to view as property. That's not strength. That's liability. The bodies hanging behind his father swayed slightly in the draft from open windows, their shadows dancing across marble floors. Kedrick had grown up surrounded by this particular brand of justice, brutal, public, designed to communicate that Ravenspire's power was absolute and resistance was suicide. He'd never questioned it before. Now, looking at his father's cold calculation, Kedrick wondered when exactly he'd stopped seeing strength in that expression and started seeing emptiness. "Where is she?" he asked. "Your wife is in her quarters being guarded." The old Duke's emphasis on the word wife suggested he was using it as an insult. "I've restricted her movements until we're certain Octavian's people won't make another attempt. She's valuable, after all. Can't have your emotional attachment getting her killed." "She's not an attachment, she's—" "What?" his father interrupted. "Your partner? Your equal?" "Don't embarrass yourself, Kedrick. She's a girl from a ruined house who exists in Ravenspire because we allow it. The moment she stops being useful, she becomes disposable, just like everything else." Kedrick should have agreed, should have acknowledged the brutal logic that had governed his entire life up to this point. Power required sacrifice. Sentiment was weakness. Survival meant making hard choices without flinching. But standing there in that throne room, surrounded by executed conspirators and his father's absolute certainty, Kedrick felt something fundamental shift. Not a rejection of power. He still understood that strength mattered, that weakness invited destruction. But maybe there was a difference between being powerful and being his father. "I want to see her," he said quietly. "You'll see her when I decide it's appropriate." "No." Kedrick met his father's eyes directly, recognizing the risk and taking it anyway. "I'll see her now, or we're going to have a very different conversation about who actually controls Ravenspire's future." The old Duke went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that preceded either violence or capitulation. For a long moment, they stood there measuring each other, two predators determining hierarchy. Then his father smiled, and it was the coldest thing Kedrick had ever witnessed. "You think you're ready to challenge me? I think I'm ready to stop pretending this is about my best interests instead of your control." "Interesting," the old Duke said. "Very interesting. Fine. Go see your wife. Comfort her if that makes you feel powerful. But understand something, Kedrick. Every choice you make that prioritizes her over Ravenspire's strategic position makes you weaker. And when you're weak enough, I will replace you. With who? Kedrick asked. You have one heir. One son trained to inherit everything you've built. Remove me and Ravenspire collapses within a generation. Then I suppose you'd better hope your sentimentality doesn't become terminal. Kedrick left before his father could see the rage in his expression, ignoring the guards who fell into formation behind him. The castle corridors felt different now, oppressive in a way they never had before, like he was seeing Ravenspire clearly for the first time and recognizing it as the prison it had always been. He found Serafina in her quarters staring out the window at the courtyard below, where servants were cleaning blood from cobblestones. She'd changed from her wedding gown into something simpler, darker, mourning clothes that made her look like she was attending a funeral instead of recovering from an assassination attempt. You shouldn't be here, she said without turning around. Your father made it very clear I'm supposed to remain isolated until his interrogations are complete. My father doesn't control who I see, doesn't he? Serafina finally looked at him, and her expression was complicated. You just defied a direct order to come here. That's either bravery or stupidity, and I haven't decided which yet. Kedrick closed the door, noting the guards positioned outside. His father's people, loyal to the old duke rather than to him. They'd report this visit within the hour, add it to whatever evidence his father was collecting about Kedrick's reliability. He didn't care. How are you? He asked. Alive, she said, terrified, angry, trying to understand why you stepped in front of me when every lesson you've ever learned said not to. I already told you why. You told me something beautiful and terrifying right before you passed out from blood loss. Serafina moved away from the window, her posture defensive. I need you to tell me again when you're conscious and capable of understanding what you're saying. Kedrick had spent 3 days thinking about this moment, rehearsing different approaches. He could lie, claim the confession was drug-induced confusion, could retreat to strategic explanations about protecting valuable assets, could rebuild the walls that had briefly crumbled in the cathedral. Instead, he told her the truth. I spent my entire life learning that attachment was fatal, that caring about anything gave enemies a weapon aimed directly at my throat. My father taught me that power requires isolation, that the moment you love something is the moment you become vulnerable to losing it. He paused, recognizing how difficult the next words would be. But standing in that cathedral, watching Harwick move, calculating angles and probabilities, I realized something. I didn't care about strategic advantage anymore. I didn't care about maintaining alliances or protecting Ravenspire's reputation. I cared about keeping you alive because the alternative was unacceptable. Serafina's expression suggested she was hearing something she'd hoped for and feared simultaneously. That's not strategic thinking. No, Kedrick agreed, it's not. That's the kind of emotional decision that gets powerful men killed. Probably. So why make it? Because, he said, and felt the last of his carefully constructed armor crack completely. Because I'm starting to think my father is wrong. That isolation isn't strength. That surrounding yourself with people who fear you instead of choosing you just means you die alone even if you win everything else. Serafina was quiet for a long time, studying his face like she was searching for lies. You understand what you're saying, right? You're telling me that somewhere between our negotiation in the library and the wedding ceremony, you stopped viewing this as a transaction. Yes. That you actually care whether I live or die. Yes. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see silver flecks in those storm-colored eyes. That's either the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me or the most elaborate manipulation I've encountered. I can't tell which. It's honest, Kedrick said. Unfortunately. Why unfortunately? Because honest makes me vulnerable. And vulnerable men don't survive in places like Ravenspire. Serafina reached up, her fingers hovering near the bandages on his shoulder without quite touching. You saved my life, she said quietly. Took acid that would have destroyed my face and made me useless for every political purpose your father had planned. That's not vulnerability, that's choice. Same thing. No, she corrected. Vulnerability is weakness you can't control. Choice is strength applied deliberately. You chose to protect me. That's different from being unable to stop yourself. Kedrick caught her hand before she could pull away, his fingers wrapping around hers. The touch was electric, dangerous, the kind of contact that changed equations and made simple situations complicated. I'm not good at this, he said. At what? at caring about someone without trying to own them, at wanting something beyond power and survival. My father spent 28 years training me to be ruthless, and I don't know how to be anything else.
Then don't be anything else, Serafina said. Be ruthless. Be strategic. Be every terrifying thing Ravenspire needs you to be. But maybe be those things for something beyond fear and control.
Like what? Like actually building something worth protecting. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in navigating Ravenspire's political chaos while trying not to get killed by remaining conspirators. The old duke executed 3 more nobles with confirmed viral connections, displaying their bodies on pikes along the castle walls. The message was clear. Betraying Ravenspire came with consequences that extended beyond death into permanent public humiliation. But executions didn't stop the rumors. Word spread through the northern territories that the young duke had been wounded protecting his wife. That sentiment had compromised his judgment, that Ravenspire's heir was becoming soft. Several minor houses began quietly repositioning their alliances, calculating whether the old duke would actually replace Cadric or if the transition represented opportunity. Octavian, from his fortified position in virile territory, sent a formal letter congratulating Cadric on his marriage and expressing regret about the unfortunate incident at the ceremony. The letter was polite, diplomatic, and absolutely transparent in its actual message. I know you're weak now. I'm waiting to see how long before that weakness becomes fatal. Kedrick read it twice before burning it in his study's fireplace, watching expensive parchment curl and blacken. You know he's going to move against us again, Voss said from across the desk. The assassination attempt failed, but it exposed exactly what he wanted, proof that you'll sacrifice advantage for emotional attachment. I'm aware. And your plan for dealing with that is what exactly? Cadric looked up from the flames. I haven't decided yet. Part of me wants to ride into virile territory with enough soldiers to level his fortress and mount his head on a spike. The other part recognizes that overreaction plays into his narrative about Ravenspire being dangerously unstable. The tactical part of you or the emotional part? Both, Kedrick admitted. Which is the problem. I can't separate what I want from what's strategically sound anymore. Voss studied him with an expression that might have been concern on a less disciplined face. Your father is preparing to move against you if this continues. He's been meeting with council members, testing their loyalty, building support for declaring you unfit to inherit. Let him try, Cadric said, surprised by how calm he felt. If he wants Ravenspire badly enough to destroy his only heir, that says more about him than it does about my judgment. It says he values power over family, which you've always known. Yes, but I'm starting to think that's not the strength he pretended it was. It's just loneliness wearing armor. Voss was quiet for a moment. She's changing you. The Veil Girl. Serafina, Cadric corrected. Her name is Serafina. Fine. Serafina is changing you. The question is whether that change makes you stronger or gets you killed. Cadric didn't have an answer for that. He was still trying to figure it out himself. He found Serafina in the library late that night, reading military treatises by candlelight, like some people read poetry. She'd developed a habit of studying Ravenspire's military history, cataloging victories and defeats, analyzing strategy with the same precision she applied to court politics. You're going to damage your eyes, he said from the doorway. She looked up, and even exhausted, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. Then I'll get spectacles and continue reading. Some of us find knowledge more valuable than perfect vision. Kedrick moved into the library, closing the door behind him. His father's guards were everywhere now, monitoring movements, reporting conversations. Privacy was becoming increasingly theoretical. We need to talk about what happens next, he said. Next implies we survived what happened already. I'm not convinced we did. We're alive. That counts as survival. Serafina set down her book, her expression serious. Your father is going to remove you if you don't prove you're still capable of ruthless decision-making, and proving that probably requires throwing me away as a liability. Yes, Cadric agreed. That would be the smart choice. So why aren't you making it? Because smart choices got me to 28 years old, surrounded by people who fear me and nothing I actually care about. He sat across from her, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. I'm done optimizing for survival at the expense of everything else. That's a death sentence in Ravenspire. Probably.
But at least I'll die having chosen something instead of just inheriting someone else's nightmare.
Serafina reached across the table, her hand covering his. You can't save me and save yourself simultaneously. Your father has made sure of that. Then I'll choose you and deal with the consequences.
Don't, she said quietly. Don't make me responsible for your destruction. I've watched powerful men ruin themselves for women before, and it never ends with anything except resentment. This isn't about you being a woman. It's about refusing to become the kind of monster who measures worth in utility. Serafina's fingers tightened around his. What's your plan? Kedrick had been thinking about this for days, running scenarios and calculating probabilities. The answer kept coming back to the same impossible choice. Leave Ravenspire. She stared at him. What? My father's power is absolute here. Every guard, every servant, every noble house, they all answer to him first. I can't challenge him directly without starting a civil war that destroys everything. But if we leave, if we take enough loyal soldiers and establish ourselves somewhere beyond his reach, we can build something different. You're talking about exile, about abandoning your inheritance. I'm talking about choosing life over legacy. Serafina pulled her hand back, her expression torn between hope and horror. If you leave Ravenspire, your father will declare you a traitor. Everything you've built, everyone who respects you, it all disappears. Yes. And you're willing to accept that? To become nothing for someone you've known less than 2 months? Kedrick met her eyes directly. I'm willing to accept that the man my father wants me to be is already nothing that matters. If leaving is what it takes to become something else, then that's what I'll do. The library was absolutely silent except for crackling candles and their breathing. When? Serafina finally asked. 3 days. There's a supply caravan heading to the border territories. We join it, disappear into the eastern forests, make our way to neutral ground where my father's influence doesn't reach. That's not a plan. That's suicide with optimism. It's the only option that doesn't end with me executing you to prove I'm still my father's son. Serafina stood, pacing to the window. Below, Ravenspire sprawled across the cliffs like a fortress designed to keep people in rather than enemies out. Your father will hunt us. He'll send soldiers, assassins, every resource Ravenspire possesses. I know. We'll spend the rest of our lives running. Maybe. Or maybe we find somewhere strong enough to stand against him. Build alliances with houses he's alienated. Turn his brutality into a liability instead of an asset. You're describing a war. I'm describing survival on our terms instead of his. She turned back from the window, and her face was the most vulnerable he'd ever seen it. If I agree to this, if we run, it can't be about you saving me. I need you to understand that. I won't be your redemption project or the thing you protected because it made you feel less monstrous. This isn't about redemption, Kedrick said. This is about choosing what I want my life to mean instead of letting it be dictated by someone else's paranoia. What do you want it to mean? He stood, moving close enough to see exhaustion and fear and desperate hope in her eyes. I want it to mean I was brave enough to risk everything for something real instead of dying alone in a castle full of people who hated me. Serafina studied his face like she was memorizing every detail. That's the most terrifying thing you've ever said to me. Why? Because it means you're serious. Because it means this isn't just strategic thinking or temporary emotion. You actually intend to throw away Ravenspire for the possibility that we might build something better. Yes. She kissed him then, sudden and fierce, the kind of kiss that felt like both declaration and farewell. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. 3 days, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. Planning an escape from Ravenspire was like planning a prison break from the inside while the warden watched your every move. Kedrick spent the next 2 days moving through his normal routines, training with soldiers, attending council meetings, maintaining the appearance of the dutiful heir, preparing to inherit his father's empire. But beneath the surface, he was systematically identifying who could be trusted, who would report to the old duke, and who might be convinced to follow him into exile if the price was right. Voss was the first person he approached. They met in the armory late at night, surrounded by weapons that had seen generations of violence. The old soldier looked tired, aged in a way that suggested he'd spent decades carrying weight that never got lighter. I need to know if you're loyal to me or to Ravenspire, Kedrick said without preamble. Voss didn't pretend to misunderstand. Those used to be the same thing, but they're not anymore. No,
Voss agreed. They're not. Your father has made it clear he values control over everything else, including his son's well-being. So the question becomes whether I follow the man or the institution. And your answer? Voss was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along a sword that had belonged to Cedric's grandfather. I've served House Mordain for 32 years, watched your father build Ravenspire into something powerful and absolutely hollow. Watched you grow up learning all his worst lessons and somehow managing not to become him completely. He looked up, and his expression was resolved. If you're leaving, I'm coming with you. Not because I believe exile will work, but because someone needs to keep you alive long enough to figure out what you're actually fighting for. Cedric felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. How many men can we trust? 20. Maybe 25 if we're lucky. The rest will report to your father the moment they suspect something. 25 soldiers against everything Ravenspire can field. Cedric did the math automatically, calculating odds that were spectacularly terrible. That's not an army. That's a suicide mission. Yes, Voss agreed. But at least it'll be your suicide mission instead of slowly dying in a place that mistakes cruelty for strength. The second night, Cedric found his father waiting in his quarters. The old duke sat in Cedric's chair like he owned it, which technically he did. Everything in Ravenspire belonged to him until death or formal inheritance transferred power, including the son who was currently planning betrayal. We need to discuss your future, his father said calmly. Cedric remained standing, recognizing the power dynamic being established. What about it? You're making a mistake with the Veil Girl. I've been patient, assuming you'd recognize that sentiment is temporary and strategic thinking would eventually reassert itself. But you've continued prioritizing her comfort over Ravenspire's interests. Her comfort and Ravenspire's interests aren't mutually exclusive, aren't they? The old duke stood, his presence filling the room. You've restricted her movements less than I ordered. You've allowed her access to military documents and council discussions that should remain confidential. You've positioned guards loyal to you rather than to me outside her quarters. That's not protecting an asset. That's building an independent power base. Cedric felt ice slide down his spine. His father knew. Not everything, maybe, but enough to be dangerous. She's my wife. Protecting her seems appropriate. Protection doesn't require giving her information that could be used against Ravenspire if her loyalties prove flexible. The old duke moved closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you planning to betray me? Cedric had prepared for this conversation, rehearsed different responses. Denial would be safest. Claim his father was paranoid, that protecting Serafina was about maintaining alliance stability rather than personal attachment. But looking at the old duke now, seeing that cold calculation that had governed every decision his entire life, Cedric felt exhausted pretending. Betray implies I owe you loyalty beyond what you've earned. I'm planning to leave. That's different. His father's expression didn't change. Where? Somewhere your control doesn't reach. Somewhere I can build something that doesn't require destroying everyone who gets close. You'll be hunted. Every house in the north will know you abandoned Ravenspire. You'll be branded a coward and a traitor. Better a living coward than a dead tyrant. The old duke smiled, and it was absolutely terrifying. You think exile will save you? That running away changes what you are? No, Cedric said. I think staying here guarantees I become exactly what you are, and I'd rather die trying to be something else than succeed at being you. His father moved so fast, Cedric barely registered the attack. One moment they were talking, the next the old duke had him by the throat, slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack stone. Everything you are, his father hissed, I built. Every skill, every victory, every shred of power you possess came from me. And you think you can just walk away? Cedric didn't struggle, recognizing that physical resistance would escalate violence into something fatal. I think I can try. That's more than you ever gave me. The old duke held him there for a long moment, fingers tight enough to restrict breathing but not quite enough to kill. Then he released, stepping back with perfect control. You have until dawn, he said quietly. After that, I declare you an enemy of Ravenspire, and everything I've taught you about mercy being weakness applies. Take your soldiers, take your wife, run as far as you can. But understand that I will find you, and when I do, I will kill you both to prove that sentiment is fatal." Kedrick rubbed his throat, tasting blood. "Why wait until dawn? Why not just execute me now? Because I want you to understand what you're throwing away." His father moved to the door, pausing before leaving. "Power, legacy, everything I built for you. You're choosing to destroy it for a woman you barely know. I want that choice to haunt you for whatever brief time you have left." The door closed, leaving Kedrick alone in quarters that suddenly felt like a tomb. He had maybe 6 hours before his father's forces would begin hunting them. 6 hours to organize an escape that would determine whether the rest of his life was spent running or dead. Midnight found Kedrick in the stables, coordinating with Voss and the 23 soldiers who'd agreed to follow him into exile. Most of them looked terrified, which was appropriate. They were abandoning safety and certainty for the possibility that their young duke knew what he was doing. Kedrick wasn't sure he did. The escape plan was brutally simple. They'd leave through the eastern gate during the guard rotation, join the supply caravan scheduled to depart at dawn, and disappear into the trade routes before the old duke could organize pursuit. It wasn't elegant or particularly clever, but complex plans required coordination that they didn't have time to establish. Simple meant survivable. Hopefully. He found Serafina in her quarters, already dressed in traveling clothes that made her look like a merchant's daughter rather than aristocracy. She'd packed light, a single bag containing documents, some jewelry, practical items that could be sold or traded if they needed resources. "Your father knows," she said when he entered. "Yes. And we're leaving anyway." "Yes." She studied his face, searching for doubt or hesitation. Found neither, apparently, because she nodded once. "Then let's go before I start thinking too carefully about what we're doing." They moved through Ravenspire's corridors like ghosts, avoiding main passages and guard posts. Kedrick had grown up in this castle, knew every secret route and hidden passage that hadn't been used in decades. His father would eventually remember these paths and seal them, but tonight they were still viable. The eastern gate was manned by 2 guards Voss had bribed into temporary blindness. They looked away as Kedrick's group slipped through, their silence purchased with enough gold to ensure they'd leave Ravenspire themselves before morning. Outside the castle walls, the northern territories stretched dark and frozen under stars that felt impossibly distant. Kedrick had spent his entire life inside Ravenspire, surrounded by stone and steel and absolute certainty about how power worked. Now he was walking away from all of it with 23 soldiers and a woman he'd known for 8 weeks. The supply caravan waited at the rendezvous point, its guards confused but compliant when Voss explained that the Duke's party needed to join them. Gold changed hands, questions were discouraged, and within an hour, they were moving east toward territories where the old Duke's influence weakened with every mile. Serafina rode beside Kedrick, her posture perfect despite exhaustion. "You realize we can never go back," she said quietly. "I know. You realize your father will dedicate everything to hunting us, that we'll spend years looking over our shoulders waiting for assassins. I know. You realize this might not work, that we could die in some unnamed forest without ever building anything meaningful." Kedrick looked at her, memorizing the way moonlight caught her face. "I know. But at least we'll die having chosen this instead of slowly suffocating in a place that mistakes control for love." Serafina reached over, her hand finding his. "Then I suppose we'd better make this worth dying for." Behind them, Ravenspire's towers disappeared into darkness. Ahead, the eastern forests waited like an open question. And Kedrick Mordain, heir to nothing and future uncertain, realized he'd never felt more alive than in this moment of absolute catastrophic choice. They rode through the night, leaving everything behind. The only certainty was that his father would come for them. The only question was whether they'd be strong enough to survive when he did. The eastern forest swallowed them whole, and for 3 days Kedrick allowed himself to believe they might actually survive. The caravan moved through territories where Ravenspire's influence thinned like smoke dissipating in wind. Small villages that had never heard of the Mordain name. Trade routes controlled by merchant guilds rather than aristocratic houses. Places where power was measured in coin and product rather than bloodlines and military strength. It felt like freedom, which should have been the first warning that something was catastrophically wrong. They made camp on the 4th night in a clearing beside a river that cut through the forest like a silver blade. The soldiers established a perimeter while Voss organized watch rotations, his movements efficient despite exhaustion. Serafina sat near the fire, cleaning dirt from beneath her fingernails like she was scrubbing away the last traces of aristocratic softness. "How long before your father catches up?" she asked without looking at him. Kadric was sharpening his sword, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone oddly meditative. Depends on how quickly he can organize pursuit. Could be days, could be weeks. He won't stop, though. That's not who he is. And when he finds us, then we find out if 23 soldiers are enough to hold off everything Ravenspire can field. Kadric tested the blade's edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. Probably not. But at least we'll die having chosen this. You keep saying that like dying is acceptable, as long as it's a choice. It's better than living without one. Serafina finally looked at him, firelight catching the exhaustion in her face. I grew up watching powerful men make speeches about honor and choice right before they got everyone around them killed. My father made similar declarations about dignity before he sold me to settle his debts. So forgive me if I'm skeptical about noble sentiments when the consequence is still a corpse. Kadric set down the whetstone, recognizing the fear beneath her anger. We're not going to die. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep us alive. That's more certainty than staying in Ravenspire offered. She was quiet for a moment, watching flames consume wood. Do you regret it? Leaving everything behind. The question deserved honesty, so Kadric gave her that. Every morning I wake up and realize I abandoned the only life I knew for something completely uncertain. Every night I lie awake calculating odds that are objectively terrible. So yes, part of me regrets it. He paused, finding the rest of the truth. But then I look at you, and I remember what staying would have required, becoming my father, turning you into property, spending the rest of my life surrounded by fear instead of anything real. And when I think about that alternative, this doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like the first honest decision I've ever made. Serafina stood, moving around the fire to where he sat. Her hand touched his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with unexpected tenderness. You're nothing like what I expected when I arrived at Ravenspire, she said quietly. What did you expect? A monster. The kind of man who would own me without seeing me, who would use me until I stopped being useful and then discard me like broken furniture. And now? Now I think you're a monster trying very hard to become something else. I'm just not sure if people like us get to change or if we're too damaged by what made us. Kadric pulled her down beside him, her body fitting against his like they'd been designed to occupy the same space. We find out together. That's the deal. She kissed him then, slow and deliberate, the kind of intimacy that felt like both promise and apology. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. Don't let me be the reason you die, she whispered. I couldn't survive knowing I destroyed you. You're not destroying me. You're giving me something worth protecting besides my own survival. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, and Voss came to tell Kadric his watch shift had started. Serafina returned to her tent while Kadric took position at the camp's perimeter, scanning darkness for threats that might be hours or days away. The forest was alive with sound, wind through branches, nocturnal animals hunting, the river's constant whisper. Normal sounds that should have been comforting. But Kadric had spent too many years learning to recognize when normal was a mask hiding something lethal. And something about this forest felt wrong. The attack came at dawn when exhaustion made people careless. Kadric was checking the perimeter when he heard the first scream, a sound that cut through morning mist like a blade through flesh. He turned toward camp and saw chaos erupting, soldiers falling with arrows in their throats, tents burning, figures in dark armor moving through smoke with practiced efficiency. Not bandits, professional soldiers, the kind trained to kill quickly and move on before resistance could organize. His father's men. Kadric ran toward the carnage, his sword already drawn, his mind calculating angles and probabilities. 12 attackers that he could see, maybe more in the trees. His own forces were scattered, surprised, dying before they could mount effective defense. Voss was fighting 3 men simultaneously near the supply wagons, his movement still sharp despite his age. 2 of Kadric's soldiers were already dead, their bodies sprawled in positions that suggested they'd been killed before fully waking, and Serafina's tent was surrounded. Kadric felt something cold and lethal settle into his chest, the same mental state that preceded his most brutal training sessions. Fear was information, Rage was fuel. Everything else was noise that needed silencing. He hit the first attacker from behind, driving his blade through the gap between helmet and armor. The man dropped without sound. The second turned too slowly, Kedrick's sword opening his throat before he could raise his weapon. The third was better trained, recognizing Kedrick's approach and pivoting to meet it. They exchanged strikes, steel screaming against steel, until Kedrick found an opening and drove his blade through the man's chest. 3 down. 9 visible. Unknown number waiting. He reached Serafina's tent as another soldier tried to enter. Kedrick caught him by the throat, slamming him into the ground hard enough to crack bone. The man's eyes went wide with recognition. He knew exactly who he was fighting before Kedrick finished him. Serafina emerged from the tent holding a dagger, her face pale but controlled. "How many?" "Too many," Kedrick said. "We need to move now." Voss fought his way to their position, blood streaming from a cut across his forehead. "We can't hold them. We're outnumbered, and they've got archers positioned in the trees. Where are the rest of our men? Dead or dying?" Voss's expression was grim. This wasn't a patrol. This was an assassination squad sent specifically for you, which meant his father had known their route, had known exactly where they'd camp, had positioned forces to hit them when they were most vulnerable. Someone had betrayed them. Kedrick scanned the remaining soldiers, trying to identify who would sell them out. But there was no time for interrogation. The attackers were regrouping, preparing for another assault. "Fall back to the river," he ordered. "Use the water to cover our retreat." They ran through burning camp toward the sound of rushing water, arrows hissing past like angry insects. 2 more soldiers fell before reaching the riverbank. Voss took an arrow in the shoulder but kept moving, his face twisted with pain but still functional. The river was deeper than it looked, current strong enough to sweep away anyone who couldn't swim well. Kedrick grabbed Serafina before she could be pulled under, holding her against his chest while the water tried to separate them. Behind them, their attackers reached the riverbank and began firing into the water. Most of the arrows went wide, but one caught Kedrick in the leg, punching through muscle and lodging in bone. He didn't let go of Serafina. The current carried them downstream, away from the attack, into rapids that threatened to dash them against rocks. Kedrick held on to consciousness through pain and cold water, his only focus keeping Serafina's head above water. When they finally crawled onto the opposite bank 2 miles downstream, only 8 soldiers remained alive. Voss was there, still bleeding from his shoulder. The rest were faces Kedrick barely recognized through exhaustion and shock. 15 men dead in less than 20 minutes. Someone in his inner circle had sold them to his father, and Kedrick had no idea who. They found shelter in a cave system carved into the riverbank by centuries of erosion. It wasn't defensible, but it was hidden, which mattered more than fortification when you were bleeding and outnumbered. Voss collapsed against the cave wall, his face gray from blood loss. Serafina immediately began treating his wound, tearing cloth from her dress to create bandages with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done this before. Kedrick pulled the arrow from his own leg, biting down on leather to keep from screaming. The pain was spectacular, bright white and all-consuming, but pain meant he was alive. Pain meant he could still fight. "Who knew our route?" he asked Voss once he could speak without his voice shaking. "Only the people you trusted." Voss's breathing was labored. "The soldiers who agreed to follow you. Me. Her." "Don't," Kedrick said quietly. "I'm not accusing, I'm stating fact. Someone told your father where we'd be and when. That information came from inside our group." The remaining soldiers were gathered near the cave entrance, their expressions varying between exhausted and terrified. Most of them were young, barely 20, recruited because they'd shown loyalty to Kedrick during training. One of them was a traitor. Kedrick stood, ignoring the way his legs screamed protest. Every muscle wanted to collapse, but collapsing meant dying, and he refused to die in a cave like cornered prey. He approached the soldiers slowly, studying each face, looking for tells, avoidance, guilt, fear that went beyond normal survival instinct. Found nothing conclusive. "Who here has family still in Ravenspire?" he asked. 3 hands went up. Standard. Most soldiers maintained some connection to home even when serving elsewhere. "Who here received messages in the last week before we left?" 2 hands. Also normal. Letters from loved ones weren't unusual. "Who here," Kedrick said very quietly, "was approached by my father's people with an offer to betray me?" Silence. Then one of the younger soldiers, a kid named Marcus, who couldn't be older than 19, started crying. Not obvious tears, just silent water streaming down his face while his body shook. Kaedric moved to stand directly in front of him. "What did they offer you?" "My sister," Marcus whispered. "They have my sister in Ravenspire. Said they'd execute her if I didn't report your location." "When did you send this message?" 2 days ago. Before we made camp. I used a courier bird at the last village." Kaedric felt rage building in his chest, the kind that usually preceded extreme violence. This boy had gotten 15 men killed, had nearly gotten Serafina killed, had betrayed everything for family, which was exactly what Kaedric had done by leaving Ravenspire. The parallel was uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kaedric asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "Because you would have killed me." Marcus was still crying, his whole body trembling. "Or left me behind. And then my sister dies anyway. So instead you got our people killed and my father knows exactly where we are." "I didn't have a choice," Marcus said desperately. "You don't understand what it's like to have someone you love held hostage. You'd do anything to protect them. Anything." Kaedric looked at Serafina, saw her expression torn between sympathy and horror. Then he looked at Voss, who was watching this interaction with the resignation of someone who'd witnessed similar situations dozens of times. The old soldier's expression said what Kaedric already knew. Marcus had to die. Not because of morality or justice or any noble concept, but because keeping him alive meant accepting betrayal as survivable, which meant the next person who faced a similar choice would make the same calculation. Mercy here became weakness. Forgiveness became liability. Every lesson Kaedric had ever learned said to execute the traitor and move on. But looking at this terrified kid who'd made an impossible choice to save someone he loved, Kaedric saw himself. Saw the exact same calculation he'd made when deciding to protect Serafina over maintaining Ravenspire's interests. The only difference was that Kaedric had power, and Marcus didn't. "How old is your sister?" Kaedric heard himself ask. 14, Marcus whispered. "She works in the kitchens. Hasn't done anything wrong except being related to me." Kaedric closed his eyes, feeling exhaustion and pain and the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. When he opened them again, his mind was made up. "You're going to go back to Ravenspire," he said. Marcus's face went white. "My lord, please, You're going to go back," Kaedric continued, "and you're going to tell my father exactly where we are. You're going to report that we're injured, outnumbered, and hiding in a cave system approximately 2 miles downstream from where he attacked us." Marcus stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand." "You're going to give him the truth," Kaedric said. "And you're going to tell him that I know about the betrayal, that I've executed you for it, that I'm down to 7 soldiers and running out of options. But I'll be alive." Marcus's voice was small, disbelieving. "You'll be alive, and your sister will be safe, and my father will think he's won." Kaedric met the boy's eyes. "In exchange, you're going to do exactly one thing for me when you get back to Ravenspire." "Anything," Marcus said desperately. "Anything, my lord. You're going to remember that I showed you mercy when every rule I was taught said to kill you. And when the time comes, and it will come, you're going to return that mercy by helping someone else who's trapped in an impossible situation." Kaedric pulled out a knife and made a shallow cut across Marcus's face, enough to bleed dramatically but not enough to scar permanently. "Tell him I tortured you before the execution, that you barely escaped. Make it convincing." The other soldiers were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to anger. They'd lost friends in the attack. Marcus's betrayal had cost them dearly, and Kaedric was just letting him walk away. Voss looked like he wanted to object but was too exhausted to argue. Serafina's face was impossible to read. Marcus stumbled toward the cave entrance, still crying, clutching his bleeding face. He looked back once, his expression suggesting he couldn't believe he was being allowed to live. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me," Kaedric said. "Just remember." Marcus disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than stone. One of the soldiers finally spoke up. "My lord, with respect, you just let a traitor go free. How do we know he won't sell us out again?" "Because he's already done the damage he can do," Kaedric said. "My father knows where we are regardless of what Marcus reports. The only question now is what we do with that information." "And what do we do?" Voss asked quietly. "We give my father exactly what he wants," Kaedric said. "We let him think he's won." The plan was insane, which was probably why it had any chance of working. Kadric's father would expect them to run deeper into the eastern territories, trying to put distance between themselves and pursuit. That's what frightened prey did when cornered. That's what the old duke's tactical experience would predict. So instead, they were going to circle back toward Ravenspire, not to the castle itself. That would be genuine suicide, but to the outer territories where loyal houses had served Mordan for generations. Places where Caedric's reputation might still carry weight, where soldiers might choose the heir over the father if properly motivated. It meant traveling through hostile territory with 7 exhausted soldiers and 2 wounded leaders. It meant gambling that old alliances would hold when tested. It meant trusting that at least some of the northern houses were tired of the old duke's brutality and ready for change. It was absolutely, catastrophically stupid. You realize this is exactly the kind of emotional decision that gets people killed, Serafina said when he explained the plan. They were alone in the back of the cave while Voss organized what remained of their supplies. Kadric's leg throbbed with every heartbeat, the wound showing early signs of infection despite Serafina's treatment. Yes, he agreed, but running forever means dying slowly. At least this way we have a chance. A chance at what? Taking Ravenspire from your father with 7 soldiers? A chance at forcing him to fight openly instead of hunting us through the forest like animals. If we can get even 3 houses to declare for us publicly, it stops being an execution and starts being a succession dispute. And succession disputes can be negotiated. Serafina studied his face in the dim light. You really think any house will risk your father's anger to support you? I think some of them are tired of being afraid. I think fear only works as a control mechanism when people believe there's no alternative. If we can show them that resistance is possible, that my father isn't invincible, they'll see you as viable rather than just rebellious. Exactly. She was quiet for a long moment. This is going to get you killed. Probably, Kadric agreed, but at least I'll die trying to build something different instead of just running from what I left behind. Serafina kissed him, fierce and desperate. When we die, she said against his mouth, I want you to know that I never believed in redemption or second chances or any of that beautiful nonsense people tell themselves to sleep better. But you made me believe that choosing to be different counts for something even if the ending is still tragic. We're not dying yet, Kadric said. No, she agreed, not yet. But soon, probably. They rejoined the others and began the journey back toward Ravenspire, through forests that had witnessed generations of violence and would probably witness their deaths before the week ended. 3 days of traveling brought them to the border of House Blackwood's territory. Lord Brennan Blackwood was old military aristocracy, the kind of noble who'd served Caedric's grandfather before the old duke claimed power. His house controlled strategic mining operations that supplied iron to half the northern territories. Losing Blackwood's support would cripple Ravenspire's military production, which meant he was either their best hope or their fastest execution. They approached Blackwood Castle at dusk, when shadows made their small numbers less obvious. The fortress sat on a hillside overlooking mines that scarred the landscape like open wounds. Guards challenged them at the outer gates, crossbows raised. Identify yourself, the captain ordered. Caedric stepped forward, ignoring the way his wounded leg threatened to collapse. I'm Caedric Mordain, heir to Ravenspire. I'm requesting an audience with Lord Blackwood. The guards exchanged glances. The old duke has declared you an enemy of the realm. We're under orders to execute you on sight. Then execute me, Caedric said calmly. But do it after you've informed Lord Blackwood that I died at his gates. Let him explain to the other houses why he murdered the duke's son without trial or negotiation. It was a gamble. The guards could just kill them and claim they'd never arrived. But aristocratic politics required witnesses, and killing Caedric publicly meant dealing with consequences. The captain looked uncertain. Wait here. He disappeared into the fortress, leaving them surrounded by armed guards and exposed in the courtyard. Serafina stood close enough that Caedric could feel her breathing, her hand resting near the dagger she'd kept since the attack. If this goes wrong, she whispered, I'm taking at least 3 of them with me. If this goes wrong, we're all dead before you can draw that blade. Then I'll die fast, she said, better than whatever your father has planned. Lord Blackwood finally appeared on the fortress battlements, his white hair and scarred face making him look exactly like what he was, a soldier who'd survived 4 decades of northern violence. "You have significant courage or terminal stupidity coming here," he called down. "Your father has offered a considerable bounty for your head." "I'm aware," Kedrick said. "I'm also aware that House Blackwood has served Mordain for 3 generations based on mutual benefit rather than fear. I'm here to offer you a choice." "I'm listening." "Continue serving my father, who views your house as disposable resources to be used until exhausted, or support me in establishing a different kind of leadership, one that values alliance over subjugation." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to commit treason based on your promise that you'll be better than the man who's held absolute power for 30 years? That's an ambitious sales pitch, boy." "I'm not asking you to commit treason," Kedrick said. "I'm asking you to honor the original agreements your grandfather made with mine. Agreements based on respect and mutual benefit. My father has corrupted those treaties into one-sided extraction. I'm offering to restore balance." "By doing what exactly?" "You have 7 soldiers and a death sentence. What possible leverage do you possess?" "The leverage of being right." Kedrick met the old lord's eyes directly. "Every house in the north knows my father rules through fear. They obey because disobedience means destruction. But fear only works until someone stands up and survives. Be that first house, Lord Blackwood. Force my father to negotiate instead of dictate. And if he refuses to negotiate, then we fight and at least one of us doesn't survive. But either way, the system changes. Either I win and establish new terms, or he wins and proves that resistance is fatal. But the current state, where everyone pretends they have a choice while actually being hostages, that ends." Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, studying them with eyes that had witnessed too many betrayals to trust easily. "If I support you," he finally said, "your father will come for my house with everything Ravenspire can field. He'll burn my mines, execute my family, make an example so brutal that no one else dares consider rebellion." "Yes," Kedrick agreed. "That's the price of choosing differently. I can't promise safety. I can only promise that the alternative is slow suffocation under a tyrant who values control over everything else." The old lord's expression suggested he was calculating odds that were spectacularly terrible and trying to decide if principle was worth annihilation. Then he smiled, sharp and dangerous. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said. "Come inside before your father's scouts find you bleeding in my courtyard. We have considerable planning to do if we're going to survive what comes next." The War Council that night included Lord Blackwood, his military advisors, and representatives from 2 other houses who'd apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. House Ryland controlled the northern ports. House Thorne managed grain production across the eastern valleys. Together with Blackwood's iron mines, they represented approximately 30% of Ravenspire's economic foundation. Not enough to defeat the old Duke militarily, but enough to force negotiation if they presented a unified front. "Your father's strength is absolute control," Lord Ryland was explaining, his finger tracing supply routes across a map. "He's built a system where every house depends on Ravenspire for military protection, which means defying him feels like suicide. But that control is also his weakness. The moment multiple houses resist simultaneously, he can't crush all of them without destroying the economic infrastructure that makes Ravenspire powerful. So we create a crisis he can't solve through violence alone," Kedrick said, following the logic. "Exactly." Blackwood leaned forward. "We coordinate public declarations of support for your succession claim. Not rebellion, succession dispute. Frame it as internal Mordain family business rather than regional uprising. Forces the other houses to take sides publicly instead of privately supporting your father while claiming neutrality. And when he responds with military force, we defend our territories and make it costly enough that even if he wins, Ravenspire is weakened." Lady Thorne's voice was sharp. "Your father rules through projected invincibility. Shatter that projection, and his control starts fracturing." Kedrick studied the map, seeing his father's positions, their potential defensive strongholds, the supply lines that would determine who could sustain a prolonged conflict. The math was brutal. Even with 3 houses supporting him, Kedrick's forces were outnumbered, approximately 4-1. The old Duke controlled the best-trained soldiers, the most defensible positions, and had decades of strategic experience. But wars weren't won purely through numerical advantage. They were won through will, through convincing enough people that change was possible, through making the cost of the old system higher than the risk of trying something new. How long before my father learns we're here? Kedrick asked. Blackwood grimaced. He probably already knows. Marcus would have reported your general direction, and this is the logical place you'd seek alliance. I'd estimate we have maybe 2 days before Ravenspire forces arrive to demand your surrender. Then we use those 2 days to coordinate our declarations and establish defensive positions. Kedrick looked around the table. This only works if we move simultaneously. If even one house delays, my father will isolate and crush them before the others can provide support. Agreed, Ryland said. We announce together or not at all. They spent the next 6 hours planning coordination, supply chains, defensive strategies. It was exhausting work, made worse by Kedrick's wounded leg, and the knowledge that every decision might be their last. Seraphina sat beside him throughout, occasionally asking questions that revealed her understanding of logistics and political maneuvering. The other lords treated her with cautious respect, recognizing that she was more than decorative. When the council finally adjourned near midnight, Kedrick found himself alone with Blackwood in the strategy chamber. I need to know something, the old lord said quietly. Why did you really leave Ravenspire? The official story is that you abandoned your inheritance for a woman, but I've known you since you were a child. You're not that sentimental. Kedrick was too tired to lie. I left because becoming my father required destroying everything I cared about. Because power without purpose is just organized violence, and I was tired of hurting people to prove I could. That's sentiment, Blackwood observed. Maybe, Kedrick agreed, but it's also pragmatism. My father's system works through fear, and fear requires constant reinforcement. Eventually, you run out of people to terrify, or they get tired enough to risk death. I'd rather build something that people choose to support instead of something they obey because the alternative is execution. Blackwood poured them both whiskey, the expensive kind reserved for celebrating victories or mourning defeats. Your father is going to try to kill you. Not capture, not negotiate. Kill. You understand that? Yes. And you're prepared for what that means? Fighting your own father to the death? Kedrick took the whiskey, feeling the burn as it went down. I've been preparing my entire life without realizing it. Every lesson he taught me about ruthlessness and control, I'm going to use them against him. The difference is, I'm fighting for something beyond just survival. What are you fighting for? The chance to prove that power doesn't require brutality, that leadership can be chosen instead of enforced, that maybe, just maybe, people like us can change what we are. Blackwood drained his glass. You're either going to revolutionize the North or die spectacularly trying. Either way, it'll be historic. They drank to that bitter truth while outside Blackwood Castle. The night pressed close, and Ravenspire's forces moved closer with every hour. The old Duke arrived exactly 48 hours later with 200 soldiers and absolutely no interest in negotiation. Kedrick watched from Blackwood's battlements as his father's forces took positions surrounding the fortress. They moved with practiced efficiency, establishing siege lines, cutting off supply routes, preparing for either quick surrender or prolonged assault. Lord Blackwood stood beside him, his expression grim. He's not even going to offer terms. He's just going to starve us out or break through our walls. Here, because terms would acknowledge this as a negotiation rather than an execution. Kedrick recognized his father's strategy immediately. The old Duke needed this to look like putting down a rebellion rather than a succession dispute. Needed other houses to see that defying him resulted in total destruction. A messenger approached under white flag, which suggested the old Duke was at least willing to communicate even if he wasn't willing to negotiate. The message was brief and absolutely brutal. Surrender Kedrick Mordain within the hour, or I burn Blackwood Castle to the foundation and execute everyone inside as co-conspirators. This is not negotiable. No demand for Seraphina's return. No offer of reduced punishment, just complete capitulation or total destruction. Kedrick read it twice, feeling something cold settle into his chest. His father wasn't trying to reclaim a wayward son. He was eliminating a threat to his absolute control. Lord Blackwood looked at him. What do you want to do? Kedrick studied the siege lines, calculating odds and options. His father had overwhelming force. Blackwood's defenses were good, but not impenetrable. A prolonged siege would end with everyone inside dead or captured, unless they changed the terms of engagement. Send a message back, Kedrick said. Tell him I'll surrender on one condition. What condition? Single combat. Me against him. Winner takes Ravenspire. Losers' supporters go free. Blackwood stared at him. Your father won't agree to that. He's not going to risk everything on personal combat when he has military advantage. He will if I make it about pride instead of tactics. Cadric smiled without humor. My father spent 30 years building a reputation as the most dangerous man in the North. He won't be able to resist proving it. And if you lose, then I die, and this ends without everyone else getting slaughtered. At least Seraphina and the others survive. That's martyrdom, not strategy.
It's both, Cadric said. Either I win, and we've solved the succession problem permanently, or I lose and I've bought everyone else's survival with my death. Either way, someone lives to build something different. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. You really believe you can defeat him? Cadric thought about every training session his father had overseen, every lesson in ruthlessness and efficiency, every scar he carried from those brutal educations. No, he said honestly, but I believe I can make it costly enough that even if he wins, the other houses will see him bleed. And that changes everything. The message was sent. The old Duke's reply came within minutes. Accepted. Dawn tomorrow. No interference from either side. Cadric read it and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to settle onto his shoulders like armor made of consequences. He was going to fight his father to the death in front of witnesses from every major house in the North. One of them wouldn't survive the day. And the only certainty was that the Northern Territories would never be the same regardless of who won. He found Seraphina in their quarters, staring out the window at the gathering darkness. I heard, she said without turning around. You challenged your father to single combat. That's either incredibly brave or the stupidest thing you've ever done. Probably both. You're going to die, she said flatly. He's trained 40 years longer than you. He's faster, stronger, more experienced. You have a wounded leg and exhaustion. The math is brutal. I know. Then why? She turned to face him, her expression devastated. Why throw away everything we've built just to prove a point? Because the point matters, Cadric said. Because showing other houses that resistance is possible matters. Because dying free matters more than living in his cage. Seraphina crossed the room, her hands framing his face. I didn't let you save me just so you could die, proving you're not your father. That's not poetic. That's just wasteful. What would you have me do? Watch him burn this castle and everyone in it? Let him prove that defiance is fatal? I'd have you survive, she said fiercely. I'd have you be smart instead of noble. I'd have you choose life over legacy. Some things are more important than survival. Not to me, she said, not anymore. You made me believe that choosing differently was possible, that we could build something beyond what we were raised to accept. And now you're throwing that away for a gesture. It's not a gesture, Cadric said gently. It's the only way to change the system without getting everyone killed in the process. Seraphina kissed him then, desperate and furious, her fingers digging into his shoulders hard enough to bruise. When she pulled back, there were tears on her face. If you die tomorrow, she said, I'm going to be so angry at you that I'll find a way to resurrect you just so I can kill you myself. That seems fair. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll fight to win, not to prove a point, not to make a statement, to actually survive and come back to me. Cadric looked at this woman who'd entered his life as a transaction and become the only thing that made power feel like something beyond organized violence. I promise I'll try, he said. It was the most honest thing he could offer. And as the night deepened and dawn approached, Cadric Mordain prepared to fight his father, knowing that regardless of who won, the man he'd been when he first arrived at Ravenspire was already dead. The only question was what would be born from that ending. Dawn came like a blade cutting through darkness, cold and merciless, and absolutely final. Cadric stood in Blackwood's armory watching servants prepare his equipment with the kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. Sword sharpened to surgical precision. Armor fitted and checked for weak points. Leather straps tested and retested until failure became statistically improbable. None of it would matter if his father was faster. You don't have to do this, Voss said from the doorway. His shoulder was still bandaged from the river ambush, his face gray from blood loss that hadn't fully healed. We could still fight our way out, take our chances in the Eastern Territories, and abandon everyone here to my father's revenge? Cadric tested the weight of his sword, feeling the balance. That's not survival. That's just delayed death. Better delayed than immediate. Kaedric looked at the old soldier who'd been more father to him than the man he was about to fight. You taught me that leadership means making decisions others won't. That real strength is choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. This is me applying those lessons. I taught you tactical thinking, not martyrdom. Same thing when the tactics run out. Voss was quiet for a moment, his expression suggesting he was watching someone he'd trained since childhood walk towards certain death and couldn't figure out how to stop it. Your father is going to kill you. You understand that? All the training, all the preparation, he's simply better, more experienced, more ruthless. He spent 40 years learning how to destroy threats, and you're the biggest threat he's ever faced. I know, Kaedric said, but knowing something is dangerous doesn't mean avoiding it. Sometimes it means walking toward it anyway because the alternative is worse. What's worse than death? Living as the person I'd have to become to survive under his rules. The servants finished their preparations and left, closing the door with respectful silence. Kaedric stood alone in the armory, surrounded by weapons that had witnessed generations of violence, each one a reminder that northern politics was always settled through blood in the end. The wound in his leg throbbed with every heartbeat, infection making the pain sharper than it should be. The healers had offered to numb it with medicines that would dull sensation and make him slower. He'd refused. Pain was information. It told him when he was pushing too hard, when his body was reaching its limits, when death was getting close enough to taste. Besides, going into this fight numb felt like cheating himself of the full experience. If he was going to die, he wanted to feel every second of it. Serafina found him there 20 minutes before the appointed time, dressed in practical clothing that suggested she'd given up on aristocratic pretense entirely. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed everything. Fear and fury and desperate hope, all fighting for dominance. I brought you something, she said, holding out a leather cord with a small silver ring threaded through it. Kaedric recognized it immediately. Vale family crest, the only piece of her inheritance that hadn't been sold to settle debts. Why? Because if you're going to die proving a point, I want you to die knowing someone chose you. Not your title, not your power, not what you could provide. Just you. She stepped closer, fastening the cord around his neck with fingers that trembled slightly. The ring settled against his chest, warm from her skin. This is a terrible idea, she said quietly. Everything about this is tactically unsound, emotionally reckless, and probably going to end with me watching you bleed out in front of half the northern territories. Probably, Kaedric agreed. So why do I feel like this is the first honest thing either of us has done since we met? Because it is. Kaedric pulled her close, memorizing the feel of her body against his. Every other decision we've made has been about survival or strategy, or navigating systems designed to destroy us. This is the first time I'm choosing what I want instead of what I'm supposed to want, and what you want is to fight your father to the death. What I want is to prove that power doesn't have to require brutality, that leadership can be about building something instead of just controlling it. Your ring reminds me why that matters. Serafina kissed him, slow and deliberate, like she was trying to memorize the taste. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. If you die out there, she said, I'm going to make sure everyone knows it wasn't because you were weak. It was because you chose to fight for something better than what you were given. That's all I can ask for. No, she said fiercely. You can ask to survive. You can ask to win. You can ask to come back to me and actually build the thing you're willing to die for. Don't make your death poetic when your life could be revolutionary. I'll do my best. Your best better be enough. She left before he could see her completely break down, her footsteps echoing through stone corridors until silence swallowed them whole. Kaedric stood alone in the armory, feeling the weight of her ring against his chest, and knowing that regardless of what happened in the next hour, the man he'd been when he first entered Ravenspire was already dead. The only question was whether something better would survive to take his place. The combat ground had been established in the clearing between Blackwood Castle and the Old Duke's siege lines, neutral territory where both sides could witness without interfering. Representatives from every major house in the Northern Territories stood in carefully maintained positions, their faces showing varying degrees of anticipation and dread. This wasn't just combat. This was the entire power structure of the North being decided through single combat, witnessed by everyone who mattered. History was being written in blood and steel, and the historians were all watching,
Kadrick walked onto the field feeling every eye measure him, calculate his chances, predict his death. His armor was good quality but not ornate, practical rather than ceremonial. His sword was the same weapon he'd trained with since adolescence, familiar weight that felt like an extension of his arm. His father stood across the clearing wearing black plate armor that had seen actual warfare, not just ceremonial display. Every scratch and dent told stories of violence survived, enemies destroyed, dominance established. The old Duke looked exactly like what he was, a predator that had spent 40 years perfecting the art of killing anything that challenged his supremacy. Lord Blackwood stood between them, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced authority. The terms are established and witnessed: single combat to submission or death. Winner claims Ravenspire and all territories sworn to House Mordain. Losers' supporters receive amnesty and safe passage. He paused, looking between father and son. Any final words before we begin? The old Duke smiled, cold and absolutely certain. I taught you everything you know, Kadrick. Every technique, every strategy, every lesson about survival. You can't defeat the man who built you. Kadrick met his father's eyes directly. You taught me how to be ruthless. You never taught me what to be ruthless for. That's the difference between us. Sentiment won't save you when I open your throat. No, Kadrick agreed. But at least I'll die for something instead of just dying alone. Blackwood stepped back, raising his hand. At the signal, combat begins. May the worthy claim victory. The hand dropped, and 40 years of accumulated rage and resentment and brutal education erupted into violence. Kadrick's father moved first, closing distance with speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone his age. The opening strike came high, forcing Kadrick to raise his guard, then pivoted low toward the wounded leg. Classic feint. Textbook misdirection. Kadrick barely deflected it, his sword catching his father's blade inches from his thigh. The impact sent shockwaves through his injured leg, pain bright and immediate. First blood went to the old Duke, not from the strike itself, but from the wound reopening under stress. Kadrick felt warmth spreading down his leg, blood soaking through bandages. His father pressed the advantage immediately, a rapid sequence of strikes designed to overwhelm defense through sheer volume. High, low, center, each one perfectly weighted to force reaction without allowing counterattack. Kadrick gave ground, his mind cataloging patterns even while his body screamed protest. His father fought like he ruled, absolute control, overwhelming force, no mercy for weakness. But overwhelming force required energy, and energy eventually depleted. Kadrick weathered the assault, blocking what he couldn't dodge, dodging what would kill him, accepting minor cuts that bought him time to analyze. His father's technique was flawless, decades of experience translating into efficiency that bordered on artistry. But efficiency had patterns, and patterns could be exploited. The old Duke's next strike came from the right, identical angle to 3 previous attacks. Kadrick stepped inside instead of blocking, closing distance until their swords locked together, their faces inches apart. You're slower than you used to be, Kadrick said quietly. Age comes for everyone, his father replied. But experience matters more than speed. The old Duke headbutted him, metal helmet crashing into Kadrick's forehead with enough force to split skin and blur vision. Kadrick stumbled back, tasting blood, his equilibrium shattered. His father capitalized immediately, a thrust toward the chest that would have ended the fight if Kadrick hadn't twisted aside at the last instant. The blade scored across his ribs instead of through them, armor deflecting enough force to prevent fatal penetration. Pain was no longer localized. It was everywhere, constant, a baseline of agony that made thinking difficult and movement exhausting. The witnesses watched in absolute silence, their expressions frozen between horror and fascination. This wasn't ceremonial combat. This was raw violence between 2 men who understood killing and weren't pretending otherwise. Serafina stood among them, her face pale, but her eyes never leaving Kadrick. He could see her fear, her barely controlled panic, her desperate hope that somehow this would end differently than every tactical calculation predicted. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, but lying required breath he couldn't spare. His father attacked again, relentless and precise, every strike designed to exploit the openings that exhaustion created. Kadrick's defense was degrading, his blocks coming slower, his footwork less certain. The math was simple and brutal. His father could sustain this pace indefinitely. Kadrick couldn't. Eventually,
probably soon, he would make a mistake fatal enough that no amount of desperation could compensate.
The only question was whether he could land one decisive strike before that happened. "You're dying on your feet," his father observed, almost conversational despite the violence.
"I can see it in your eyes."
"That recognition that you've overestimated yourself and underestimated me. It's the same look I saw in everyone who challenged me over the years." Kedrick blocked another strike, his arms shaking from the impact. "Maybe. But at least I tried. Trying means nothing without winning. It means everything if it shows others that trying is possible." His father's expression suggested Kedrick had said something profoundly stupid. "Philosophy doesn't matter when you're dead. Then I'll make sure my death teaches better lessons than your life." Kedrick shifted his grip, recognizing that conventional technique was failing and desperate measures were becoming necessary. His father had trained him in proper form, classical approaches designed for duels between equals. But this wasn't between equals. This was between a master and a student who'd learned that sometimes winning required breaking all the rules. Kedrick dropped his sword. The movement was so unexpected that even his father hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating whether this was surrender or strategy. That fraction was enough. Kedrick dove inside his father's guard, ignoring the blade that sliced across his shoulder, and drove his fist into the old duke's throat. Not a killing blow, but enough to disrupt breathing and create opening. His father staggered, reflexive defense rising to protect his neck. Kedrick grabbed his own sword from where it had fallen and brought it up in a strike that would have disemboweled the old duke if he hadn't twisted aside. Instead, it opened a deep gash across his father's thigh. First significant damage. The crowd erupted into shocked murmuring. Kedrick had actually wounded the old duke. Not fatally, but visibly. Blood stained his father's armor, bright and impossible to ignore. The invincible had bled, and bleeding meant vulnerable. His father's expression transformed from confident superiority to something darker and infinitely more dangerous. "You little bastard, I taught you honor." "You taught me survival," Kedrick corrected, breathing hard. "Honor was never part of the curriculum." "Then, let me remind you what happens when you abandon it." The old duke's next assault was pure rage disguised as technique. Faster, harder, less controlled, but somehow more terrifying for the raw violence it contained. This wasn't a master teaching a lesson anymore. This was a father trying to kill the son who dared to wound him. Kedrick barely survived the next 30 seconds. His blocks were desperate, his dodges millimeters from fatal. His father's blade found flesh repeatedly, shallow cuts across his arms, a deeper one along his ribs, one that nearly took his eye before Kedrick jerked his head aside. Blood loss was becoming critical. Vision was starting to tunnel. His body was sending increasingly urgent signals that collapse was imminent. But collapsing meant dying. And dying meant his father won. Meant everything they'd risked meant nothing. Meant Serafina watched him fail. Unacceptable. Kedrick forced his body beyond exhaustion into something else. Some reserve that existed past rational thought. Pain became background noise. Blood loss became a problem for later. The only thing that mattered was moving, blocking, surviving one more second. His father's blade came for his throat in a strike designed to end this definitively. Kedrick caught it on his sword, their weapons locking together again, both of them bleeding and exhausted and absolutely refusing to yield. "You can't win," his father hissed. "Even if you kill me, you'll bleed out before anyone can save you. This ends with both of us dead and Ravenspire in chaos." "Then chaos it is," Kedrick said. "Better chaos with the possibility of something new than order maintained through terror." "You're a fool. I'm your son. I learned from the best." Kedrick headbutted his father the same way the old duke had done to him earlier, metal crashing into metal, both of them staggering back with fresh blood streaming down their faces. The witnesses were transfixed, watching two men destroy each other with the kind of intimate violence that only family could achieve. This wasn't political anymore. This was personal. Decades of accumulated damage erupting into mutual annihilation. Both combatants were slowing now, their movements degraded by exhaustion and blood loss. The old duke's legendary speed was compromised by the leg wound. Kedrick's defense was fragmenting from cumulative damage. They circled each other like dying wolves, each looking for one final opening. "You should have stayed loyal," his father said. "I would have given you everything. You would have given me your nightmare and called it inheritance. Is freedom worth dying for? Ask me when I'm dead." They crashed together again, swords screaming against each other, both men using what little strength remained to try for killing blows that the other barely deflected. And in that exchange, Kadric saw it, the pattern his father had used his entire life, the subtle tell that preceded every decisive strike. The way the old duke shifted his weight fractionally to the left before committing to an attack, a habit so ingrained that 40 years of practice had made it invisible. Except Kadric had spent 28 years watching those patterns, learning them, internalizing them until they became predictable. His father shifted left. Kadric was already moving right. The old duke's blade passed through empty space where Kadric's chest should have been, and Kadric's sword found the gap between armor plates at his father's side, punching through leather and into flesh beneath. Not a killing blow, but deep, serious. Enough to matter. His father gasped, the sound raw and utterly human. He stumbled back, hand going to the wound, blood flowing between his fingers. The clearing went absolutely silent. The old duke stared at the blood on his hand like he couldn't quite process what it meant. Then he looked at Kadric, and his expression cycled through shock, rage, and something that might have been pride if he'd been capable of that emotion. "You've gotten better," he said quietly. "I had a good teacher. Not good enough to make you obedient." "No, but good enough to make me effective." His father tried to raise his sword for another attack, but his body wasn't cooperating anymore. Blood loss and exhaustion had finally caught up to decades of invincibility. He sank to one knee, his breathing labored. "Yield," Kadric said. "It's over." The old duke laughed, the sound wet and painful. "I've never yielded to anything in my life. I'm not starting with you. Then die stupid and stubborn. That seems appropriate." Kadric moved closer, his own vision starting to gray at the edges from blood loss. His father looked up at him, and for the first time in Kadric's memory, the old duke's expression showed something other than calculating superiority. He looked tired, just profoundly, existentially exhausted. "If you kill me," his father said quietly, "you become exactly what you're trying to avoid. A son who murdered his father for power. How is that different from what I've done? It's different because I'm doing it to end a system instead of perpetuate one. Systems don't end. They just change management. Then I'll be better management. You'll fail." His father's breathing was deteriorating, his face pale beneath the blood. "You're too sentimental, too willing to trust, too convinced that people are fundamentally good when history proves they're fundamentally selfish." "Maybe," Kadric said, "but I'd rather fail trying to build something better than succeed at maintaining your nightmare." He raised his sword, preparing for the final strike. His father didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't show any emotion except that bone-deep exhaustion. "Make it quick," the old duke said. "That's the only mercy I'll ask for." Kadric looked at this man who'd taught him everything except how to be human, who'd built an empire through fear and called it strength, who'd confused control with love and isolation with power, and he lowered his sword. The crowd gasped, confused murmuring spreading through the witnesses. His father stared at him in shock. "What are you doing?" the old duke demanded. "Making a different choice," Kadric said. "You yield or you bleed out. Those are your options. But I'm not going to kill you and prove that violence is the only way power changes hands. That's weakness. No. That's choosing what kind of man I want to be instead of what you taught me to become." His father's expression suggested Kadric had done something incomprehensible. "If you don't kill me, I'll recover and come for you again. I'll never stop hunting you. Never stop trying to destroy everything you build." "I know," Kadric said calmly, "but at least you'll do it as a wounded, discredited old man instead of an invincible tyrant. Everyone here just watched me beat you, watched you bleed, watched you break. Your power was always about projected invincibility. I just shattered that projection." He looked at the assembled witnesses, his voice carrying across the clearing. "The old duke has lost. By the terms established, Ravenspire and all territories sworn to House Mordan are now mine to rule. Any house that wishes to challenge that can face me the same way my father just did." Silence greeted the declaration. No one moved, no one spoke. Then Lord Blackwood stepped forward and knelt. "I recognize Kadric Mordain as rightful Duke of Ravenspire and pledge House Blackwood's continued service." One by one, the other witnesses followed. Lords and ladies kneeling before a man who'd just defeated the most feared leader in the North without delivering a killing blow.
The old Duke watched this happen with an expression that suggested his world had fundamentally inverted. "You're making a mistake. Mercy is weakness." "We'll see," Kadric said. "Maybe it is.
Maybe I'll regret this tomorrow, but at least I'll regret it as myself instead of as a copy of you." He turned to Voss, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, looking like he'd witnessed something impossible. "Get him medical treatment. Keep him confined until we've established clear succession. No contact with potential supporters. No communication beyond basic necessities. And then? Then we figure out how to build something that doesn't require destroying everyone who questions it." The victory celebration at Blackwood Castle was subdued, more relief than triumph. Kadric's forces had won without most of them dying, which exceeded everyone's expectations but didn't feel particularly glorious. Kedric himself was in the medical wing being stitched back together by healers who looked increasingly concerned about blood loss and infection. His leg wound had worsened during combat. His ribs were potentially cracked. The cut across his shoulder would scar impressively. He was alive, though, which was more than tactical analysis had predicted. "You're insane," the chief healer muttered while working on his leg. "Clinically, catastrophically insane. Fighting with an infected wound. Losing that much blood. You should be dead." "But I'm not. Give it time. Infection hasn't finished with you yet." Serafina appeared in the doorway, her face still showing traces of the terror she'd experienced watching the combat. She dismissed the healers with a gesture that suggested she'd tolerate no argument. When they were alone, she moved to his bedside and slapped him hard enough to turn his head. "Don't ever do that to me again," she said, her voice shaking. "Probably going to be hard to avoid if we're ruling Ravenspire." "I'm serious, Kadric. Watching you bleed out while I could do nothing was the worst experience of my life. Worse than being sold. Worse than arriving at Ravenspire. Worse than the assassination attempt. Because at least in those situations I had some control." "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't undo trauma." She sat beside him, her hands gripping his with desperate strength. "You won. You actually beat your father and claimed Ravenspire. But if the cost was losing you, I don't know if any of this would have been worth it." Kedric pulled her close despite the pain it caused. "I'm here. Damaged but functional. We survived." "We survived," she agreed. "Now what?" "Now we figure out how to actually rule. How to transform a system built on fear into something people choose to support." "That's going to take years. Decades, maybe." "Good thing we're young then." Serafina laughed, the sound carrying exhaustion and relief and desperate hope. "You're ridiculous. Bleeding, probably infected, barely able to stand, and you're planning political reformation. Someone has to. It doesn't have to be you specifically." "Yes, it does." Kedric met her eyes. "Because if not me, then who? Who else has the position and the motivation and the willingness to actually try changing things?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we do it together. Both of us. Not you protecting me or me supporting you. Partners building something new." "Partners," Kedric agreed. They sealed it with a kiss that tasted like blood and possibility. 3 days later, Kedric stood before the assembled northern houses in Blackwood's Great Hall and made the declaration that would define his rule. "The system my father built was effective but unsustainable. Fear works until people get tired of being afraid. Control works until the cost of maintaining it exceeds the benefits." His voice carried across the hall, steady despite the bandages visible beneath his formal clothing. "I'm not interested in maintaining that system. I'm interested in building something different. Treaties based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. Alliances chosen rather than enforced. Power that serves rather than simply dominates." Some of the older lords looked skeptical. Power that serves was a concept foreign to northern politics. But others, younger lords, representatives from houses that had suffered under his father's rule, looked hopeful. "This will require changes," Kedric continued. "Renegotiating treaties, establishing councils with actual authority rather than advisory roles, creating mechanisms for dispute resolution that don't default to violence. And if houses refuse these changes," Lord Harwick called out, "if they prefer the old ways, then they're free to leave," Kedric said simply. "I'm not going to force cooperation. That would just recreate my father's system with prettier language. But houses that remain in alliance with Ravenspire will be held to new standards." He paused, letting that sink in. Standards that include not executing people for disagreement. not extracting resources until territories collapse, not treating alliances as ownership. The hall was silent, lords and ladies processing the implications. Then Lady Thorne stood, her expression thoughtful. You're describing a fundamental transformation of northern power structures. That's either revolutionary or naive. Possibly both. Probably both, Kedrick agreed. But the alternative is continuing a system we all know is rotting from within. My father built something powerful and absolutely hollow. I'd rather build something that lasts because people choose to maintain it. And your father? Lord Ryland asked. What happens to him? He remains confined until I'm certain he won't attempt to reclaim power through violence. After that, Kedrick hesitated. Recognizing this was the decision that would define whether he was actually different from the old Duke. After that, he'll be given a choice. Accept the new system and live out his years in comfortable exile, or continue fighting and face execution. You're giving him a choice, Blackwood observed. That's more than he ever gave anyone else. Yes, because the moment I start executing people without trial is the moment I become him. The assembled lords exchanged glances, calculating implications and predicting consequences. Then they began pledging support. Not universal, not even unanimous, but enough. Enough to suggest that maybe, possibly, building something different was actually achievable. That night, Kedrick found himself alone in Blackwood's tower, overlooking territories that now answered to him. Ravenspire was his. The northern houses had sworn allegiance. He'd defeated his father and claimed inheritance through combat that everyone witnessed. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt exhausted and slightly terrified. Ruling was infinitely more complex than fighting. Fighting had clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Ruling required navigating competing interests, managing egos, balancing short-term necessities against long-term goals. He had absolutely no idea if he was capable of any of it. You're catastrophizing, Serafina said from the doorway. I'm being realistic. There's a difference. She joined him at the window, her hand finding his. You just overthrew the most powerful tyrant in the north through single combat and convinced half the houses to support political reformation. I think you can handle administration. Administration is different from revolution. Revolution is dramatic and clear. Administration is boring and complicated. Then be dramatic about making it less boring. Kedrick smiled despite his exhaustion. That's your solution? Make governance entertaining? Make it meaningful. Make it about actually helping people instead of just maintaining control. Make it something worth the effort instead of just obligation. She had a point, though implementing it would be brutally difficult. What do you think my father is feeling right now? Kedrick asked quietly. Probably rage that you beat him. Possibly confusion about why you didn't kill him. Definitely calculating how to reclaim power. You think I should have executed him? I think mercy without accountability is just delayed betrayal, Serafina said carefully. But I also think you're trying to prove that change is possible. That requires taking risks. Previous rulers wouldn't accept. What if I'm wrong? What if mercy gets me killed? Then you die having tried to be better than what you were taught. That counts for something. Does it? Kedrick looked at her. Or is it just elaborate suicide with philosophical justification? Serafina was quiet for a moment. When I first arrived at Ravenspire, I thought powerful men were all the same. That they wore different faces but ultimately wanted identical things. Control, dominance, validation through fear. And now? Now I think some of them are capable of choosing differently if they're brave enough to risk it. You've proven that choice is possible. The question is whether you can sustain it when things get difficult. Things are already difficult. They're going to get worse before they get better. Encouraging, Kedrick said dryly. I'm not here to encourage you. I'm here to remind you that you're not doing this alone. She kissed him, and the contact felt like anchoring to something solid when everything else was uncertain. When they separated, Kedrick looked back at the territories spreading beneath Blackwood's tower and tried to imagine what they could become if he succeeded. Not a perfect system. Perfection was impossible with human nature being what it was. But maybe something better than fear. Maybe something people chose rather than endured. Maybe something worth the blood it cost to claim. The old Duke's confinement chambers were well appointed but unmistakably prison. Guards rotated every 6 hours. Windows were barred. The only exit required passing through 3 checkpoints. Comfortable imprisonment for a man who'd spent 40 years never being constrained by anything except his own ambition. Kedrick visited him a week after the combat, his own wound still healing but mobility mostly restored. His father sat by the window reading military treatises like he was still planning campaigns instead of confined permanently. "Come to gloat?" the old duke asked without looking up. "Come to talk. Same thing from your perspective." Kedrick sat across from his father, studying the man who'd defined his entire existence. The old duke looked diminished somehow, age and defeat combining to erode the invincibility that had defined him. "I'm offering you a choice," Kedrick said. "Accept what's happened. Acknowledge that your time is over. Live out your years in comfortable exile where you can read, write, advise if I ask for it. And if I refuse, then you remain here until you die. Or I'm convinced you won't try to reclaim power through violence." His father finally looked at him, and his expression was complicated. "You should have killed me. Leaving me alive is a tactical mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The old duke smiled without warmth. "You think mercy makes you different from me? It doesn't. It just makes you slower to recognize threats. I recognize threats perfectly well. I'm just choosing to handle them differently. By giving them opportunities to destroy you. By giving them opportunities to change. There's a difference." His father was quiet for a long moment. "You're going to fail. This reformation you're planning, it requires people being fundamentally better than they are. And people are selfish, short-sighted, and willing to sacrifice everything for temporary advantage." "Maybe," Kedrick agreed. "But maybe they're only like that when the system rewards those behaviors. Change the incentives, and you might change the outcomes." Naive. Hopeful. Again, there's a difference. The old duke set down his book. "Why didn't you kill me?" Real answer, not philosophical justification. Kedrick considered lying, offering some noble reason about breaking cycles of violence. But his father deserved honesty even if nothing else. Because killing you would have proven that violence is the only way power changes hands. And I want to prove that's not true. That people can choose differently when given the option. Even when choosing differently makes you vulnerable. Especially then. His father studied him with an expression that might have been respect if he'd been capable of that emotion. "You're either going to revolutionize the North or destroy everything I built trying. Either way, it'll be spectacular. I'm counting on it." Kedrick stood to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I understand why you ruled the way you did. Fear is effective. Control is measurable. Isolation protects against betrayal. But it also guarantees you die alone, surrounded by people who celebrate your death." His father's expression didn't change. Better to die powerful and alone than weak and loved. "We'll see," Kedrick said. He left his father in comfortable imprisonment and returned to Blackwood's strategy rooms where actual governance waited. The Northern Territories needed administering. Treaties needed renegotiating. Systems needed building. And Kedrick Mordain, newly claimed Duke of Ravenspire, had absolutely no idea if any of it would work. But he was going to try, because the alternative was becoming his father, and he'd already paid too much blood to accept that ending. The only question remaining was whether mercy would save him or kill him. He suspected he'd find out soon, because in the North, power was never stable for long. And somewhere in the shadows, people were already calculating how to challenge the Duke who'd shown mercy instead of strength. The game had changed, but the stakes remained exactly the same. Survival, legacy, and the eternal question of whether choosing differently actually mattered when the cost was always measured in blood. The first attempt on Kedrick's life came 3 weeks after he claimed Ravenspire. An assassin slipped past the outer guard rotations and made it within 20 feet of his quarters before Voss intercepted him. The fight was brief and brutal, ending with the assassin dead and Voss nursing a knife wound across his ribs that would leave yet another scar to add to his collection. They found the payment contract in the dead man's belongings. 50 gold marks deposited by an intermediary who'd covered their tracks well enough that tracing became impossible. Professional work. Expensive work, the kind of operation that required serious resources and careful planning. Someone with significant wealth wanted the new Duke dead. The list of candidates was depressingly long. "You need to increase security," Voss said while healers treated his wound. This was a probe. Next time they'll send someone better. Kedrick stood by the window of Ravenspire's war room, looking out at territories he'd claimed through violence and was now trying to transform through policy. The irony wasn't lost on him. You can't rule through inspiration while hiding behind walls and guards. It sends the wrong message. The wrong message is you being dead, Voss said bluntly. Inspiration doesn't matter when you're bleeding out with a knife in your spine. He had a point, though Kaedric was reluctant to admit it. The entire reformation he'd planned depended on being visible, accessible, different from his father's isolated tyranny. But visibility created vulnerability. Accessibility meant exposure. Being different meant abandoning the defensive measures that had kept his father alive for 40 years. There was no good answer, just trade-offs between competing risks. Double the perimeter guards, Kaedric said finally. Rotate them frequently enough that patterns become unpredictable. But I'm not hiding in this castle like my father did. If people can't see me, they can't trust that things have actually changed. Trust doesn't matter if you're dead, Voss repeated. I'd rather die building something different than live perpetuating what he created. That's very noble. Also very stupid. Probably both. Serafina entered the war room carrying documents that needed review, her expression suggesting she'd already heard about the assassination attempt. She waited until Voss left before speaking, her voice carefully controlled. How long before you start taking this seriously? I am taking it seriously. I'm just not willing to become my father in response to it. Your father survived 40 years by being paranoid and ruthless. You're trying to survive by being accessible and trusting. The math doesn't favor your approach. Kaedric turned from the window to face her. What would you have me do? Lock myself away? Execute anyone suspected of disloyalty? Turn Ravenspire back into the prison my father built? I'd have you survive long enough to actually implement the changes you're planning. Serafina set down the documents with more force than necessary. Dead reformers don't reform anything. They just become tragic stories about good intentions. So I choose between being my father or being dead. Those are my options? Those are everyone's options when they hold power, she said. The question is which risk you're willing to accept. Kaedric moved closer, studying her face. You're afraid. Of course I'm afraid. I watched you nearly die fighting your father. Now I'm watching assassins get within striking distance. How many close calls before the odds catch up? I don't know, he admitted. But hiding means abandoning everything we're trying to build. Then build it faster. Make the changes significant enough that people have something to lose if you die. Right now, you're a symbol without substance. Kill the symbol and nothing changes except management. She was right, which made the situation even more frustrating. 3 weeks wasn't enough time to transform decades of fear-based governance into something people actively supported. He'd started renegotiating treaties, establishing councils with actual authority, creating mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution. But implementation was slow, resistance was constant, and most people were still waiting to see if this was genuine change or just different packaging on the same brutality. What do you suggest? He asked. Deliver something concrete, something that materially improves lives rather than just promises future reform. Make people invested in your survival because your death would cost them something valuable. Like what? Serafina picked up one of the documents she'd brought. House Thorn controls grain production. Your father extracted so much in taxes that villages were starving while warehouses overflowed. Renegotiate those terms. Cut the extraction rate in half. Get food to people who need it. That weakens Ravenspire's revenue. It strengthens your position by proving change is real. Revenue doesn't matter if you're dead. The logic was sound, though his father would have called it weakness. Reducing extraction meant reducing power. Less revenue meant fewer soldiers, weaker defenses, diminished capacity to respond to threats. But his father's approach had required constant escalation. More extraction to fund more soldiers to enforce more extraction. A cycle that only ended when something broke catastrophically. Maybe breaking it required accepting temporary weakness. Do it, Kaedric said. Renegotiate with Thorn. Cut the grain extraction by half and redistribute the surplus to territories that need it. Make it public. Make sure everyone knows this is deliberate policy rather than administrative error. Serafina looked surprised. You're actually agreeing? Without arguing about tactical implications? I'm learning that sometimes the tactical choice is accepting vulnerability to build trust. Slowly, with significant discomfort. She kissed him, quick and fierce. That's the smartest thing you've said since claiming Ravenspire. Don't celebrate yet. This could still get me killed. Everything you do could get you killed. At least this way you die having helped people. Soten. The grain redistribution happened faster than Ceadric expected, primarily because Lady Thorne was thrilled to stop playing villain in the old Duke's extraction scheme. Within a month, villages that had been starving received shipments that actually sustained their populations. Warehouses that had overflowed while people died were opened and distributed fairly. The change was immediate, visible, and impossible to ignore. People started talking, not universal praise. Plenty of nobles complained about reduced revenue and weakened central authority. But common people, the ones who'd spent decades being crushed by aristocratic indifference, began cautiously hoping that maybe this new duke was actually different. Hope was dangerous. It made people invest in outcomes rather than just enduring them. And invested people defended what they valued. The second assassination attempt came 6 weeks after the first, this time targeting Serafina instead of Ceadric directly. The logic was brutally simple. Kill the woman he'd sacrificed everything for and watch him unravel emotionally. The assassin made it into her quarters before she put a knife through his throat. Ceadric found her standing over the body, her hands shaking but her expression absolutely cold. The dead man was older, professional, the kind of killer who charged premium rates and didn't miss often. Serafina hadn't given him the opportunity. "Are you hurt?" Ceadric asked, scanning her for injuries. No. She was still holding the bloody knife, her voice eerily calm. He came through the window. "Thought I'd be asleep." "I wasn't." "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "I didn't. I learned to survive men who thought women were decorative. Turns out survival skills translate." Ceadric pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat racing against his chest despite the controlled exterior. "We need to find who's funding these attacks." "I know who it is," Serafina said quietly. "Who?" "Your father." Ceadric went still. "He's confined, monitored constantly. He can't communicate with outside supporters. He doesn't need to communicate directly." Serafina stepped back, her eyes hard. He spent 40 years building networks of loyal people who believe his way was correct. Those people don't need orders. They just need to know you're weak enough to kill. You think he's orchestrating this from confinement? I think he's a symbol for everyone who preferred the old system. Kill that symbol or prove it's powerless and the attacks stop. Ceadric felt ice slide down his spine. "You're saying I need to execute him. I'm saying you need to make a choice. Keep showing mercy to someone actively trying to destroy you, or accept that some people can't be redeemed." That's exactly what he'd do. Execute threats before they could materialize. "Which makes it right. It makes it necessary," Serafina said. "There's a difference. Is there? Or is that just what we tell ourselves to sleep better after making brutal decisions?" She looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd had this exact internal debate. "I don't know. But I know that if you die because you were too principled to eliminate a clear threat, then everything you're building dies with you. Is that more moral than execution?" Ceadric didn't have an answer. He spent the next week investigating the assassinations, tracing money and connections and carefully hidden communications. The evidence was fragmentary but suggestive. Several of his father's old supporters had liquidated assets recently. Money had moved through intermediaries designed to obscure sources. Timing correlated suspiciously with the attacks. Not proof, not quite, but close enough that ignoring it became willful blindness. He visited his father's confinement again, this time without guards present. The old duke looked thinner, aged by imprisonment in ways that combat never managed. But his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still absolutely convinced of his own correctness. "Are you orchestrating the assassination attempts?" Ceadric asked directly. His father smiled. "Would you believe me if I said no?" "Probably not." "Then why ask?" "Because I want to know if you're capable of honesty even when it costs you." The old duke was quiet for a moment. "I haven't sent any direct orders, haven't communicated with supporters, haven't done anything except read and think about how badly you're destroying everything I built. But you knew they'd try." "Of course I knew." His father's expression suggested this should have been obvious. "You humiliated me publicly, proved I could bleed, took everything I'd spent 4 decades building and announced you were dismantling it. My supporters don't need orders to recognize that as existential threat. So you're responsible without being directly involved. I'm the symbol they're defending, whether I want them to or not." Ceadric studied his father's face, searching for remorse or regret or any emotion beyond cold pragmatism. found nothing except that same calculating intelligence that had defined the old duke's entire existence. If I execute you, the attacks might stop. They might, or they might escalate as revenge. There's no way to predict. If I keep you alive, you remain a rallying point for everyone who opposes change. Yes. So either choice is a gamble with my life as the stakes. Welcome to leadership, his father said. Every decision is a gamble. The question is which risks you're willing to accept. Kedrick stood, exhausted and frustrated and absolutely certain that there was no good answer to this situation. Execute his father and prove that violence was still the ultimate arbiter of power. Keep him alive and accept ongoing assassination attempts as the price of principle. Both options felt like losing. I'm not going to execute you, he said finally. His father looked genuinely surprised. Why not? It's the tactically sound decision, because the moment I start killing people for being symbols is the moment I've completely become you, and I've paid too much to end up there. Then you're a fool, the old duke said, and you'll die proving it. Probably, Kedrick agreed, but at least I'll die as myself. He left his father in confinement and returned to the impossible task of ruling territories that half wanted him dead and half wanted him to succeed. The only certainty was that neither group was going to make it easy. The crisis that would define Kedrick's rule came 3 months after he claimed Ravenspire, and it came from the direction he least expected. Duke Octavian Virel, the man who'd orchestrated the original assassination attempt at the wedding, formally requested an audience to discuss peace terms. The request was delivered by official courier with all appropriate diplomatic protocols. Octavian wanted to meet at neutral ground, discuss ending hostilities, and potentially establish alliance rather than continued opposition. It was obviously a trap. Every tactical instinct Kedrick possessed said to refuse. That meeting Octavian meant walking into another assassination attempt with better planning this time. But refusing also meant permanent war with viral territory, ongoing conflict that would drain resources and prevent any meaningful reform. And wars of attrition favored whoever could sustain violence longest, which wasn't necessarily Ravenspire given the internal opposition Kedrick faced. You can't seriously be considering this, Voss said when Kedrick mentioned the possibility. I'm considering that permanent war prevents everything we're trying to build. So does being dead, which is what happens when you meet with the man who tried to kill you twice already. Maybe, Kedrick said. Or maybe he's recognized that I'm not my father and that negotiation is actually possible. And maybe he's recognized that you're vulnerable, and this is his best chance to eliminate you. Both could be true. They argued for an hour, Voss presenting every tactical reason to refuse, Kedrick countering with strategic necessity of peace. Eventually they reached compromise. Kedrick would meet with Octavian, but with overwhelming security and prepared escape routes. It was still probably a trap, but at least it was a well-defended trap. The meeting was scheduled for a border fortress between Ravenspire and viral territories, neutral ground that neither side controlled absolutely. Kedrick brought 30 soldiers plus Voss and Serafina. Octavian arrived with similar numbers, his forces positioned defensively rather than aggressively. The two dukes met in a chamber designed for negotiation, guards stationed outside but not immediately present. Octavian was older than Kedrick expected, maybe 50, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent decades navigating northern politics. Duke Mordain, Octavian said with formal courtesy. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Duke Virel. Kedrick kept his expression neutral. I'll admit curiosity about what peace terms you're proposing given that you tried to kill me twice. Actually 3 times if we count the latest attempt, which I didn't authorize but apparently some of my allies thought would be helpful. Octavian's tone was dry. Leadership is complicated when supporters take initiative. That's one way to describe assassination attempts. It's accurate if imprecise. Octavian gestured to chairs arranged around a table. Shall we? They sat, 2 men who had been trying to destroy each other now attempting negotiation. The absurdity wasn't lost on either of them. I'm offering a formal alliance, Octavian said without preamble. Virel territory will recognize your claim to Ravenspire and cease all hostile operations. In exchange, you abandon your father's extractive policies in our border regions and establish fair trade agreements. Why? Kedrick asked. Why negotiate instead of continuing to fight? Because I've been watching your reformation efforts. Octavian's expression was thoughtful. Cutting grain extraction, establishing councils, creating dispute mechanisms. You're either genuinely trying to build something different, or you're the most elaborate fraud I've encountered. And you've decided which? I've decided that even if you're a fraud, you're a useful one. Your father's system was consuming itself. Someone needed to disrupt it. Whether you succeed or fail, the disruption creates opportunities. Opportunistic but honest. Kedrick could respect that. What guarantees do I have that this isn't another assassination setup? None beyond my word, which is worth precisely as much as you believe it to be. Octavian leaned forward. But consider the alternative. We continue fighting, draining both our territories, preventing any meaningful development while our people suffer. That serves no one except those who profit from chaos. Or you're trying to get me to lower my guard so the next attack succeeds. That would require believing I'm suicidally stupid. Killing you now, after public negotiation, makes me the obvious suspect and turns every house against me. No, Duke Mordain, if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't waste this opportunity on assassination. The logic was sound, which didn't make it safe. Kedrick studied Octavian's face, searching for tells that would indicate deception. Found calculation, but not obvious malice. What are your actual terms? He asked. Octavian produced documents outlining proposed agreements. Trade terms that were surprisingly fair, border policies that respected sovereignty rather than asserting dominance, dispute resolution mechanisms that defaulted to negotiation rather than violence. It was everything Kedrick had been trying to establish with other houses, which made it either genuine or a spectacular trap. I need to discuss this with my advisors, Kedrick said. Of course. Octavian stood. Take whatever time you need. I'll be here for 3 days. After that, the offer expires and we return to previous hostilities. Kedrick left the negotiation chamber and found Voss and Serafina waiting with identical expressions of concern. Well? Voss asked. He's either sincere or the best liar I've ever met. Which do you believe? Kedrick looked at the documents he carried. I believe he's recognized that the old system was unsustainable and is willing to try alternatives if they benefit him. Whether that counts as sincerity or pragmatism, I'm not sure. Does it matter? Serafina asked. If the outcome is the same, it matters for predicting future behavior. Sincere allies are different from pragmatic ones. They spent hours analyzing the proposed terms, searching for hidden traps or asymmetric advantages. Found some imbalance. Octavian's territory would benefit slightly more from certain trade arrangements, but nothing catastrophic. It was a genuine negotiation, not exploitation disguised as alliance, which was either proof that change was spreading or evidence that Octavian was extraordinarily patient about his eventual betrayal. Accept it, Serafina said finally. Even if it's temporary, peace gives you time to consolidate reforms. War prevents everything, and if he betrays us, then we fight. But at least we'll have tried negotiation first. Kedrick looked at Voss. Your opinion? The old soldier was quiet for a long moment. I've spent 40 years watching leaders choose war because it felt safer than trusting enemies. Most of them died violently, having accomplished nothing except perpetuating cycles they inherited. If you want to actually build something different, you have to risk trusting people your father never would have. That's not tactical advice. No, Voss agreed. It's philosophical advice. But tactics without philosophy is just organized violence. Kedrick returned to the negotiation chamber and accepted Octavian's terms with minor modifications that the older duke agreed to without argument. They signed the treaty in front of witnesses from both territories, formal documents that transformed enemies into allies. Or at least enemies who'd agreed to stop trying to kill each other. It was progress, measured and fragile and absolutely vulnerable to betrayal. But it was progress. Six months after claiming Ravenspire, Kedrick stood before the Northern Council and delivered an accounting of changes implemented. Grain extraction reduced by half across all territories. Starvation rates dropped significantly. Trade agreements renegotiated to be mutually beneficial rather than exploitative. Dispute resolution councils established in 12 major regions. Military force reduced by 20% as resources shifted to infrastructure development. The numbers were modest but meaningful. More importantly, they were real. Not promises or intentions, but actual material changes in how Ravenspire operated. The assembled lords listened with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. Some genuinely supported the Reformation. Others tolerated it while waiting for Kedrick to fail. A few openly opposed it, but lacked the leverage to resist effectively. It wasn't universal support, but it was sufficient to sustain momentum. After the council adjourned, Lord Blackwood approached with an expression that suggested complicated thoughts. "You're succeeding," he said quietly. "Not completely, not universally, but measurably. People are noticing that life under your rule is tangibly better than under your father's. That sounds like it should make you happy." It does. It also terrifies me. Why? Because success makes you a target for everyone who profits from the old system. And there are still a lot of people who preferred things when power was absolute and resistance was fatal. "I'm aware," Kedrick said. "The assassination attempts remind me regularly. Those will continue, possibly escalate. The more successful you are, the more threatened they feel. So success breeds danger." Noted. Blackwood smiled without humor. "Welcome to leadership. The reward for doing well is more people trying to kill you. Encouraging. I'm not trying to encourage you. I'm trying to prepare you for what comes next, which is consolidation or collapse. You've demonstrated change is possible. Now you need to make it permanent enough that your death doesn't immediately reverse everything. How do I do that? Make other people invested in maintaining the system. Train successors. Distribute authority so it doesn't concentrate in one person. Build institutions that outlast individuals."
That sounds like giving up power.
It's distributing power so it becomes sustainable rather than fragile. Blackwood's expression was serious. "Your father held absolute authority and died alone with everyone celebrating his defeat. You're trying to build something people choose to maintain. That requires making them partners rather than subjects." The logic was sound but psychologically difficult. Kedrick had spent his entire life learning that power required control, that delegation was weakness, that trusting others meant making yourself vulnerable. Unlearning those lessons felt like dismantling his own foundation. But maybe that's exactly what transformation required. The conversation with his father happened 8 months after confinement began, and it was the first time the old Duke looked genuinely diminished. Not physically, though imprisonment had aged him, but psychologically. Like watching Ravenspire function without him had finally broken through the certainty that had defined his existence. "You're succeeding," the old Duke said without preamble. "I've been reading the reports, watching the changes. Your approach is working in ways mine never did." Kedrick had prepared for anger or denial or calculation. Acknowledgement was unexpected and profoundly uncomfortable. "It's too early to call it success," he said carefully. "No," his father corrected. "Success isn't achieving perfection. It's demonstrating that alternative approaches can function. You've proven that governance doesn't require the brutality I thought was essential." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something Kedrick had never heard from him before. "Regret. I was wrong," the old Duke said quietly. "Not about everything. Fear is still useful. Control still matters. Strength still determines survival. But I was wrong that those were the only things that mattered. Wrong that isolation was safer than connection. Wrong that ruling through terror was sustainable." Kedrick sat across from his father, searching for manipulation or strategy beneath the words. Found only exhaustion and something that looked disturbingly like genuine introspection.
"Why tell me this? Because you deserve to know that what you're building, it's better than what I created." His father met his eyes. "I spent 40 years believing that caring about people made you weak,
That attachment was liability. That the only way to survive was becoming the most terrifying thing in any room. And now I'm confined in comfortable quarters being kept alive by the son I tried to destroy. Watching him succeed by rejecting everything I taught him." The old Duke's smile was bitter. "Turns out I was the weak one. Too afraid of vulnerability to risk building anything that mattered." "You weren't weak. You were..." Kedrick struggled for words that weren't either condemnation or absolution. "You were what your circumstances created. Same as me, same as everyone." "Perhaps. But you chose to become something different when given the same circumstances. That suggests choice matters more than I wanted to believe." They sat in silence for a long moment. Two men separated by decades of accumulated damage trying to find something approaching understanding. "I'm not going to execute you," Kedrick said finally. "I know. That's one of the many ways you're different from me. But I'm also not releasing you. You remain a symbol for everyone who opposes change, and I can't risk that yet." "I understand," his father said. "For what it's worth, I hope you succeed." I hope you build something that lasts because people choose it rather than fear it. I hope you prove that my way wasn't the only way. Why? Because if you succeed, then maybe my life wasn't entirely wasted. Maybe I managed to create something better than myself, even if I couldn't be it. Kaedric left the confinement chambers feeling like he'd witnessed something profound and slightly devastating. His father, the man who'd defined tyranny for an entire generation, had just acknowledged that love might matter more than power. It didn't erase 4 decades of brutality, but it suggested that even the most damaged people could recognize their mistakes if given enough time and perspective. Whether that counted as redemption or just belated awareness, Kaedric wasn't certain, but it felt like something approaching closure. The first anniversary of Kaedric claiming Ravenspire was marked by a gathering that would have been impossible under his father's rule. Representatives from every northern house assembled not for military display or dominance assertion, but for genuine celebration. Trade agreements that benefited everyone, grain distributions that had ended starvation, councils that resolved disputes without defaulting to violence, changes that people could see and touch and appreciate. Seraphina stood beside him on Ravenspire's battlements, watching the celebration below, her hand finding his with comfortable familiarity. A year ago, we were running for our lives through forests with 23 soldiers and terrible odds, she said. Now we're ruling territories we stole and trying not to get assassinated.
Real progress. She laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. You're terrible at accepting success.
I'm realistic about fragility. Everything we've built could collapse if I make one catastrophic mistake. True. But it could also continue growing if you stop assuming failure is inevitable. Kaedric pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his.
Do you ever regret it, agreeing to that initial arrangement? Everything that came after?
Seraphina was quiet for a moment. I regret the parts that involved nearly dying. The assassination attempts were unpleasant. Watching you fight your father while bleeding was traumatic, but I don't regret that I got to watch someone choose to be different, when every lesson they'd learned said not to. That's rare enough to be worth the trauma. We're still not safe, still vulnerable, still one successful attack away from this entire experiment collapsing.
Yes, she agreed,
but at least we're vulnerable together instead of safely alone. That feels like the better choice. Philosophy from the woman who called me catastrophically stupid for leaving Ravenspire. I contain multitudes. Also, I reserve the right to change my opinions based on evidence. Voss joined them on the battlements, his expression suggesting he had complicated news. The Southern Territories are requesting similar reforms, he said. They've been watching what you've accomplished here and want comparable changes to extraction policies and governance structures. That's good news, Kaedric said. It's complicated news. The Southern Duke is using your success to pressure his own lords. Some of them are responding by threatening rebellion. If you support him, you're taking sides in a potential civil war. If you don't, you're abandoning people asking for the exact changes you've implemented. So either choice creates enemies. Welcome to regional politics. Voss's smile was grim. Every success creates new complications. Kaedric looked out at the territories that had cost so much blood to claim and transform. A year ago, his only goal was surviving his father's rule. Now he was facing requests to export reformation beyond Ravenspire's borders, with all the political complexity that entailed. It never got simpler, just differently complicated. What do you recommend? He asked Voss. Support the Southern reforms, but don't commit military force unless absolutely necessary. Offer advice, share policy frameworks, demonstrate that change is possible. But make it clear this is their transformation to achieve, not yours to impose. That's surprisingly diplomatic for you. I've been watching you navigate politics for a year. Some of it is apparently contagious.
Seraphina squeezed Kaedric's hand. You're going to spend the rest of your life balancing these kinds of decisions, trying to help without controlling, supporting change without imposing it,
building something that outlasts you. Sounds exhausting. It is. But it's also what leadership actually looks like when you're not just maintaining inherited power. Kaedric watched the celebration below and tried to imagine what the North might become if Reformation continued spreading. Not overnight, not without resistance and setbacks and periodic catastrophic failures, but gradually, persistently. One difficult decision at a time. It wouldn't be the dramatic transformation he'd initially envisioned, but maybe slow transformation was more sustainable than dramatic revolution. Maybe lasting change required patience more than passion. 5 years after claiming Ravenspire, Cedric stood in the chamber that had witnessed his father's council meetings and felt the weight of accumulated decisions settle onto his shoulders. The Northern Territories had transformed measurably. Starvation was rare. Disputes defaulted to negotiation. Trade benefited participating regions rather than just extracting resources. People chose to maintain the system because it served them, not because resistance was fatal. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still existed. Some houses resisted reform. Occasional violence erupted when negotiation failed. But the trajectory was clear. Things were better than they had been, and better suggested that improvement was possible. His father had died 3 months prior, quietly in his sleep, his last words apparently a request that Cedric continue proving him wrong about mercy being weakness. The funeral had been small, attended by people who remembered the old duke more for what he'd become than what he'd been. Not celebration exactly, but relief that an era had definitively ended. Cedric had given the eulogy himself, speaking honestly about brutality and regret and the complicated legacy of a man who'd built something powerful and absolutely hollow. It felt like closing a chapter that had defined too much of his existence. Serafina found him in the council chamber reviewing documents that would have bored his father to sleep. Policy minutiae, budget allocations, infrastructure proposals, the unglamorous work of actual governance. "You've been here for 6 hours," she said. "Come to bed before you collapse. I need to finish these approvals. They'll still be there tomorrow." "You won't be if you work yourself to death." Cedric looked up from the documents, seeing the woman who'd entered his life as a transaction and become the thing that made power feel like something beyond organized violence. She'd changed too over the years, more confident, more willing to challenge him publicly, more integrated into actual governance rather than just decorative support. They'd become partners in ways that initial arrangement never suggested. "How's the expansion into Western territories progressing?" he asked. "Slowly. They're resistant to change, but not violently opposed. I think we can establish councils within the year if we're patient. Patience wasn't exactly my strength when we started." "No," she agreed, "but you've learned. Growth is possible even for stubborn tyrants." "Reformed tyrant," he corrected. "Still stubborn, though." She kissed him, familiar and comfortable, and suggesting that bed was a significantly better option than document review. They left the council chamber together, walking through corridors that had witnessed generations of brutal governance and were now just stone in history. Ravenspire had changed. Cedric had changed. The North had changed. Not perfectly, not completely, not without cost, but measurably, undeniably, persistently. And standing there with Serafina's hand in his, Cedric realized something that would have seemed impossible when he first fled his father's rule. He was happy, not satisfied. There was too much left to accomplish for satisfaction. Not complacent. Danger still existed and reformation remained fragile. But happy in the fundamental sense that his life meant something beyond just survival. That the work he did mattered. That the person he'd become was someone he could actually respect. That choosing differently had been worth the blood it cost. 5 years ago, he'd believed power required brutality. That caring meant weakness. That survival demanded isolation. Now he ruled territories that functioned because people chose cooperation rather than feared punishment. He'd built something that might actually outlast him. He'd proven that his father's way wasn't the only way. And lying in bed that night with Serafina sleeping beside him, Cedric Mordain finally understood what his father had died too late to learn. That real strength wasn't the absence of vulnerability. It was choosing to be vulnerable for something worth protecting. That real power wasn't dominating everyone around you. It was building something people wanted to maintain. That real leadership wasn't about being the most terrifying person in any room. It was about making rooms where people didn't have to be terrified. The journey from ruthless heir to something approaching decent ruler had cost him everything he'd inherited and nearly cost him his life repeatedly. But looking at what he'd built from those ruins, Cedric couldn't regret the price, because the alternative was becoming his father, and he'd already paid too much blood to end up there. Waltz. 10 years after claiming Ravenspire, the Northern Territories held their first regional summit, where every house sent representatives with equal voice regardless of military power. It was chaos. Beautiful, messy, frustrating chaos where people argued and negotiated and occasionally threatened to walk out, but ultimately stayed because the alternative was returning to the system everyone remembered too clearly. Kadric opened the summit with brief remarks about how far they'd come and how far they had yet to go. Then he stepped back and let the representatives actually govern themselves, intervening only when disputes threatened to become violent. It was exactly what his father would have hated, which made it exactly right. Serafina had given birth to their first child 6 months prior, a daughter they'd named Elena after the housekeeper who'd been kind to Kadric when no one else dared. The baby was currently sleeping in Serafina's arms while her mother participated in governance discussions. Voss had retired from active military service but still attended council sessions, his advice valued precisely because he had no personal stake in outcomes beyond wanting things to function well. The old soldier approached Kadric during a summit recess, his expression thoughtful. "Your father would have despised this," Voss observed. "Yes," Kadric agreed. "He would have seen it as weak leadership, abdicating authority, letting chaos replace order. And yet it's working, messily, imperfectly. But yes, it's working." Voss smiled. "You've built something remarkable, not because it's flawless, but because it's sustainable, because it doesn't depend on one person being terrifying enough to maintain it. I had help. You had support. There's a difference. The vision was yours. The willingness to risk everything for it was yours. The stubbornness to keep trying when everyone said it was impossible was yours." Kadric watched the summit representatives arguing passionately about trade policy and border disputes, their voices loud but not violent, their disagreements genuine but not fatal. This was what governance looked like when it wasn't just maintenance of inherited power. It was messy and frustrating and absolutely beautiful. "Do you think he ever understood?" Kadric asked quietly. "My father." "Do you think he died understanding what he'd missed?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "I think he died recognizing that his way wasn't the only way. Whether that's the same as understanding what he missed, I don't know. But it's more awareness than most tyrants achieve. That's not very satisfying." "No," Voss agreed. "But redemption arcs are mostly fiction. Real people just get fragmentary insights before they die. Your father got enough to acknowledge he was wrong. That's more than nothing." Kadric held his daughter while watching governance happen around him and tried to imagine what she would inherit. Not a perfect system. That was impossible with human nature being what it was. But maybe something better than brutality disguised as strength. Maybe something that valued cooperation over domination. Maybe something worth the blood it cost to build. Serafina joined him, her expression tired but content. "Summit's going better than expected. Only 2 near fistfights today. Progress. Real progress." She looked at their daughter sleeping peacefully. "Do you ever wish she could have met your father? Known that part of her history?" "No," Kadric said. "I wish he could have met her. Could have seen what building something different actually looks like. Could have understood that legacy isn't about how terrifying you were, but what people choose to maintain after you're gone. That would have required him changing fundamentally." "Yes." Which is why it never happened. He kissed Serafina, then his daughter, feeling the weight of accumulated years and decisions and transformations. The ruthless Duke who'd entered Ravenspire a decade ago no longer existed. In his place was someone who'd learned that real power wasn't about dominating everyone around you. It was about building something worth protecting, something people chose rather than endured, something that might actually outlast the person who created it. And standing there watching governance happen around him, holding the family he'd chosen and the future he'd built, Kadric Mordain finally understood the most important lesson his father never learned. That you didn't measure a life by how feared you were. You measured it by what you left behind that people wanted to keep. And looking at the North he'd transformed through blood and stubbornness and occasional mercy, Kadric knew his answer. He'd left behind something worth keeping, something built not through terror, but through the radical choice to be different than what he'd been taught. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was transformation. And transformation was enough.